You've been taught that peace comes from control, from planning every step, from holding everything together. But if that were true, why do you still feel tense even when things go your way? Why does your mind keep racing at night, replaying conversations, worrying about what might happen tomorrow? The truth is this: peace doesn't come from controlling life. It comes from releasing your grip on it. Buddhist teachings have whispered this truth for over 2,000 years, taught by the Buddha and carried through generations of monks, wanderers, and ordinary people who learned how to stop fighting reality. They discovered that suffering doesn't come from what happens. It comes from resisting what happens, from trying to manage outcomes, control emotions, and force life to obey our expectations. Tonight, as you listen, you don't need to fix anything. You don't need answers. You don't need to become someone else. You only need to let go. With each breath, your body can soften, your thoughts can slow, the pressure to control can gently dissolve. Like leaves floating down a river, you don't have to push them away, and you don't have to chase them. You can simply watch them pass. This is not about giving up. It's about resting. It's about trusting the flow of cause and condition and finding peace exactly where you are. As these teachings unfold, your nervous system will calm, your mind will loosen its grip, and the weight you've been carrying will begin to fade. And when you wake up, the world will feel lighter, not because life changed, but because you did. This is not just something to fall asleep to. This is a letting go that happens quietly, naturally, without effort. Are you ready? Let's begin. There is a quiet tension many people carry without realizing it. A feeling that sounds like fairness but feels like disappointment. A thought that whispers, "I did everything right, so why did this still happen?" This is where the next teaching begins, not as an idea to analyze, but as something already living inside your chest, waiting to be seen clearly so it can finally loosen its grip. As you settle into this moment, notice how the mind naturally wants order. It wants rules that guarantee safety. It wants effort to equal reward. It wants goodness to be repaid with goodness. This desire feels reasonable, even moral, and yet it is one of the deepest sources of hidden suffering. From a very young age, we are trained to believe in a kind of moral control. Behave well and good things will come. Work hard and life will reward you. Be patient, kind, loyal, disciplined, and the world will meet you with fairness. This belief becomes so deeply embedded that it feels like truth itself. It shapes how we love, how we work, how we endure pain. It becomes the silent contract we believe we have signed with life. Buddhism looks at this belief gently, not to mock it, but to expose its cost. Because when life does not follow the rules we were promised, something painful begins to form beneath the surface. Not loud anger, not obvious bitterness, but a quiet resentment, a subtle tightening, a sense that life has cheated us, that something is wrong with the world, or worse, with us. This resentment often hides behind good behavior. People keep showing up, they keep trying, they keep doing what they believe is right. But inside, there is a growing heaviness, a tiredness that rest does not fix, a sense of being unseen by life itself. Buddhism teaches that this suffering does not come from failure or bad luck. It comes from the illusion that morality gives us control over outcomes. In Buddhist thought, actions matter deeply, but not in the way we are used to thinking. Doing the right thing shapes the mind, it trains the heart, it reduces harm, but it does not guarantee protection from loss, illness, betrayal, or disappointment. When morality is used as a bargaining tool with reality, it becomes a trap. This is hard to accept because the belief in moral control gives us comfort. It makes the world feel predictable. It allows us to think, if I just stay good enough, careful enough, disciplined enough, nothing too bad will happen. Letting go of this belief can feel frightening, like removing the walls of a house during a storm, but Buddhism suggests something surprising. Those walls were never actually protecting you. They were only giving the illusion of safety while slowly building tension inside. The Buddha taught that life unfolds through causes and conditions, not through moral contracts. This means that every moment arises from countless factors, many of which are far beyond personal intention. Health is influenced by genetics, environment, stress, chance. Relationships are shaped by two full inner worlds colliding, not by one person's goodness. Success depends on timing, opportunity, social systems, and randomness as much as effort. When this is not understood, people turn disappointment inward or outward. They blame themselves or they blame life. Both lead to suffering. Quiet resentment often sounds like this: I was patient, but I was ignored. I was loyal, but I was abandoned. I followed the rules, but I still lost. Over time, this creates a sense of emotional debt, a feeling that life owes you something. And when that payment does not arrive, bitterness begins to grow, even if you never speak it aloud. Buddhism does not tell you to stop being ethical. It tells you to stop using ethics as armor against reality. When morality is practiced to control outcomes, it becomes fear-based. When morality is practiced without attachment to results, it becomes freeing. The difference is subtle, but life-changing. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to be good in order to be safe. It shows up as over-responsibility, as self-blame when things go wrong, as confusion when suffering appears despite your best efforts. Buddhism invites you to see that suffering is not proof of failure. It is part of existence itself. This teaching dismantles the belief that life is a courtroom where fairness is guaranteed. Instead, life is seen as a living process, complex and unpredictable. When this is deeply understood, resentment begins to soften, not because pain disappears, but because the feeling of being personally targeted by life fades away. Another layer of moral control hides in the idea of deserving. People silently measure their pain against their behavior. I didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve that. While understandable, this mindset keeps the mind locked in resistance. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not a punishment and happiness is not a reward. They are experiences arising from conditions. When this is accepted, something inside relaxes. The constant inner argument with reality quiets down. You stop asking life to justify itself. You stop needing reasons that make sense to your sense of fairness. This does not make you passive, it makes you present. Resentment often survives because it feels like a form of self-respect. Letting it go can feel like admitting defeat. Buddhism reframes this completely. Releasing resentment is not surrendering dignity, it is reclaiming peace. It is choosing not to carry extra suffering that does nothing but tighten the heart. There is also a hidden pride that lives inside moral control. The belief that, I know how things should go. When life deviates from this script, the ego feels offended. Buddhism gently points out that this pride keeps us locked in disappointment. When we release the need for life to confirm our moral expectations, humility naturally arises. And with humility comes relief. This teaching also changes how we see others. When moral control dissolves, judgment softens. You begin to see that people's outcomes are not simple reflections of their worth. Someone struggling is not failing. Someone succeeding is not necessarily superior. This understanding opens space for compassion without comparison. Many people are surprised to notice how much anger they have been holding toward life itself. Not dramatic anger, but a low-level bitterness that colors everything. Buddhism teaches that this bitterness is not resolved by trying harder or being better. It dissolves when the illusion that effort guarantees protection is seen clearly and released. This does not mean effort is meaningless. Effort shapes character. It influences conditions. It matters deeply. But it is no longer burdened with the impossible job of controlling everything. When effort is freed from expectation, it becomes lighter. You act because it is aligned, not because you are trying to secure a future. There is a quiet grief that can surface when moral control falls away. The grief of realizing that the world is not obligated to be fair. Buddhism does not rush past this grief, it allows it. Because on the other side of it is a deeper peace. A peace that does not depend on guarantees. This peace feels different from happiness built on success or approval. It is steadier. It does not collapse when plans fail. It does not turn bitter when effort is not rewarded. It comes from being in harmony with how life actually works, not how we wish it worked. When you stop believing that doing everything right will save you from pain, you stop being shocked by pain. It still hurts, but it does not feel like a betrayal. This shift alone removes a huge amount of suffering. Over time, resentment toward life fades, not because life becomes kinder, but because the fight against reality ends. You stop carrying the extra weight of, "This shouldn't have happened." What remains is the simple experience of what is, without the added story of injustice. This teaching invites a different kind of strength. Not the strength of control, but the strength of flexibility. The ability to stay open even when outcomes disappoint. The ability to remain ethical without needing applause from the universe. As this understanding settles, something subtle changes in how you move through the world. You still care. You still act with integrity. But you no longer demand guarantees. You no longer measure your worth by results. You no longer negotiate with life. There is a quiet dignity in this way of being. A calm that does not come from winning, but from no longer fighting what cannot be controlled. A softness that is not weakness, but wisdom. And as the mind begins to rest in this truth, you may notice something unexpected. The resentment you thought was protecting you has been replaced by space. Space to breathe, space to feel, space to live without constantly asking life to prove itself to you. This is not a conclusion. It is a loosening, a gentle opening that allows the next teaching to arise naturally, without force, without expectation, just as life itself does. That quiet space you just touched, the place where you stop demanding life to prove itself, creates a new kind of openness inside you. And when you become more open, something else becomes easier to notice. How often your suffering isn't coming from what happened, but from what you wish people would understand about what happened. When resentment toward life softens, a more personal ache can rise to the surface. It's the ache of speaking from the heart and still not being heard. It's the ache of being misread, of being judged too quickly, of being reduced to a version of yourself that isn't true. And if you listen closely, you'll realize this ache has been shaping many of your choices, your tone, your silence, your fear, even your kindness. There's a tender wound most people carry. It doesn't bleed, it doesn't show up on scans, but it shapes whole lives. It's the longing to be understood. Some people chase money because they want security. Some chase success because they want respect. And some chase validation because they want one simple thing. I see you, I get you, you make sense. When you don't receive that, it can feel like standing in a crowded room and still being alone. Here is the strange truth. Rejection hurts, but craving validation can hurt even more. Rejection is direct, it stings, and then it's over. But craving validation is slow poison. It makes you keep returning to the same emotional door, knocking again and again, hoping it will open. It keeps the heart leaning forward, tense, waiting. It turns your peace into a negotiation. Buddhism offers a different kind of freedom here. Not the cold freedom of not caring, not the bitter freedom of, fine, I don't need anyone, but a warm, grounded freedom. Non-attachment to being understood. This does not mean you stop communicating. It means you stop using other people's understanding as proof that you are real. Because the truth is, people misunderstand each other all the time. Even people who love each other. Even people with good intentions. even people who share the same home and the same bed. Misunderstanding isn't always cruelty. Sometimes it's limitation. Sometimes it's distraction. Sometimes it's a lifetime of personal filters. Your words pass through someone else's mind, and their mind is not neutral. It carries old pain, old beliefs, old fears, old pride. They don't hear you as you are. They hear you through what they have lived. So when you desperately need to be understood, you unknowingly hand your inner peace to the most unstable thing in the world, another person's perception. And perception is slippery. One day, someone thinks you're wise. The next day, they think you're arrogant. One day, someone praises your kindness. The next day, they call you weak. If your peace depends on their clarity, you will never rest. You will keep adjusting yourself, explaining yourself, defending yourself, polishing yourself, and shrinking parts of yourself just to fit into the frame they can handle. This is where craving validation creates suffering that rejection never could. Rejection is one moment. Craving is constant. Craving creates a mental habit. You start scanning faces, reading tone, watching response time, analyzing punctuation, hunting for signs that you are accepted. And even when things are going well, you can't fully enjoy it because your mind is busy trying to secure it. It also creates performance. Not always obvious performance. Sometimes it's emotional performance. You laugh at jokes you don't find funny. You agree quickly to avoid conflict. You soften your truth to protect someone's comfort. You over-explain because silence feels like danger. You write long messages hoping the other person will finally get it. You replay conversations, thinking of better lines, stronger points, cleaner proof. But the problem was never your wording. The problem was the attachment. The Buddha taught that attachment is a cause of suffering. Most people think of attachment as clinging to money, pleasure, relationships. But clinging to being understood is one of the most exhausting attachments because it hides under the mask of being reasonable. It sounds reasonable to want understanding. It sounds healthy. And yes, understanding is beautiful. But the craving for it is different. Craving says, if you don't understand me, I can't be at peace. Craving says, your opinion decides my safety. Craving says, I cannot rest until you agree with my story. This craving makes you vulnerable to manipulation too. Because once someone learns you need validation, they can control you by giving it and taking it away. A little approval, and you feel high. A little distance, and you feel panicked. You become emotionally trained, like a pet waiting for treats. Not because you are weak, but because the mind is hungry, and hunger has no dignity. Buddhism does not shame this hunger. It simply asks you to look at it clearly, to see the cost, to see how many nights you have lost because you wanted someone to finally understand what you meant, why you did what you did, why you were hurt, why you reacted, why you needed what you needed. Sometimes you don't even want them to change. You just want them to know. And when they don't know, it feels like your pain is invisible. That's why the craving is so intense, because it touches something primal, the fear of not mattering. This is where Buddhist practice becomes deeply practical. It teaches you how to stop making your worth dependent on being seen correctly. One of the first steps is learning the difference between expression and attachment. You can express yourself with clarity, honesty, and respect. But after you express, you let go. You don't keep pulling the other person toward your meaning like dragging a heavy suitcase. You say what is true, and you allow them to have their response. This is not easy, because the ego wants control. It wants to manage the story. It wants to protect the identity. It wants to be the good person, the misunderstood person, the reasonable person, the victim, the hero. The ego wants a clean narrative, and it wants other people to confirm it. But Buddhism teaches that identity itself is unstable. The self you defend so hard is not as solid as it feels. It is made of thoughts, memories, habits, reactions, changing all the time. So when someone misunderstands you, what exactly are they misunderstanding? A moving river. They see one moment of you and think it is the whole you. That is what humans do. They reduce complexity to something manageable. It's not always malicious. It's just the mind trying to simplify reality. When you understand this, you can start releasing the demand that others hold your full complexity with perfect accuracy. Most people cannot. Even you cannot fully understand yourself all the time. So why require it from others? Another key Buddhist insight is this: craving to be understood is often craving to be safe. Many people learned early that misunderstanding leads to punishment, rejection, abandonment, shame. So they became experts at explaining, at pleasing, at proving, at correcting misinterpretations quickly. Their nervous system treats misunderstanding like a threat. That's why a simple comment can hurt so much. That's why someone's wrong assumption can feel unbearable. It's not just about the present moment. It's old fear waking up. Buddhist practice invites you to soothe that fear without chasing external reassurance. You learn to sit with it. You learn to feel the heat in the chest, the tight throat, the urgent need to defend. And instead of acting from it, you breathe with it. You let it rise and fall like a wave. This is where silence becomes powerful, not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of someone who has stopped begging the world to confirm them. Buddhist silence is not weakness, it is freedom. When you are misunderstood, the mind often wants to rush into correction. It wants to produce evidence. It wants to argue, clarify, justify, explain. Sometimes this is useful, especially in practical matters, but often it becomes a trap. The more you explain, the more the other person resists. The more you push, the more they dig in. And your peace becomes dependent on winning a mental courtroom where the judge is already biased. Buddhist silence chooses a different path. It asks, do I need to be understood right now to be okay? If the answer is no, you let it pass. You don't feed it. You don't turn it into a war. You don't poison your night with it. This is incredibly hard for people who have always tried to be good and clear and fair, because they believe that if they just find the perfect words, the misunderstanding will dissolve. But many misunderstandings are not about words. They are about the other person's readiness, their emotional maturity, their insecurity, their need to be right, their fear of facing what you're saying. Some people can't understand you because understanding you would require them to admit something painful about themselves. So they twist your meaning, they label you, they dismiss you, they pretend not to get it. Not because you are unclear, but because clarity threatens their comfort. When you crave validation, you keep trying to crack their wall. When you practice non-attachment, you recognize the wall and you stop bleeding on it. A deep part of you may resist this teaching. It may say, but it's not fair to be misunderstood. And that's true. It's not fair. But fairness is not the question here. Peace is the question. Buddhism is not asking you to approve of misunderstanding. It's asking you to stop making it your prison. There is also a subtle form of ego in the need to be understood. It's the belief that your inner world should be grasped by others, that your truth should be recognized, that your motives should be seen. This desire is human, but Buddhism asks you to notice the attachment hidden inside it. You can still want connection. You can still value deep communication. But you release the belief that you must have it to be whole. This shift changes how you speak. Instead of speaking to be validated, you speak to be honest. Instead of speaking to control how others see you, you speak because truth is clean. You stop trying to manage your image and start living your values. And here is the surprising effect. When you stop needing to be understood, you often become easier to understand, because you stop pushing. You stop overloading your words with desperation. You stop vibrating with the energy of "please agree with me." Your message becomes simpler. Your presence becomes calmer. And people can feel that. But even if they still misunderstand, you don't collapse. Non-attachment to being understood also protects your relationships, because the craving for validation can turn love into a courtroom. You start collecting evidence. You start arguing not just about what happened, but about what it meant. You start demanding that your partner, friend, parent, or child confirm your intentions. You start needing them to see you as good. And when they don't, you punish them with coldness, lectures, withdrawal, sarcasm, or endless explanation. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when we demand that others carry our inner emotional needs perfectly. People can support you, yes, but they cannot be the foundation of your inner stability. When you release that demand, relationships become lighter. You stop asking people to constantly reassure your identity. You give them space to be imperfect. You stop taking everything as a personal statement about your worth. You become less reactive. And that itself is a form of love. This teaching also protects you from the trap of public opinion. In the modern world, misunderstanding spreads fast. People see a small piece of you and think they know the whole story. They judge quickly, they label quickly, they don't ask questions. If you are attached to being understood, this world will eat your peace alive. Buddhism trains you to be stable in the face of changing views. Praise and blame become like wind. Pleasant sometimes, unpleasant sometimes, but not your identity. A useful way to see this is to understand that being misunderstood is part of being alive. Even the Buddha was misunderstood. Even great teachers, kind people, sincere people are misunderstood. Not because they failed, but because minds differ. So the goal is not to eliminate misunderstanding. The goal is to stop suffering because of it. How do you do this without becoming emotionally closed? By practicing inner confirmation. Inner confirmation means you don't outsource your self-worth. You reflect on your actions. You ask yourself, was I honest? Was I kind? Was I clear enough? Did I act from fear or from wisdom? You take responsibility where needed. You correct what needs correcting. And then you release the rest. This is important. Non-attachment does not mean denial of mistakes. If you harmed someone, you make amends. If you were unclear, you clarify. If you were reactive, you learn. But after sincere effort, you stop begging the universe for approval through other people's reactions. You also learn to tolerate discomfort. Misunderstanding creates discomfort in the body. The mind screams, "Fix it." Buddhism teaches you to stay with that discomfort without obeying it. This is the same kind of strength you build in meditation. Thoughts come, urges come. You don't have to follow all of them. When you are misunderstood, you can practice a simple inner shift. This is painful, but I can carry it. Not by hardening, but by allowing it to be there without making it your mission to erase it. This becomes even more powerful when you realize that wanting to be understood often hides another desire. Wanting to control how you are remembered in that person's mind. You want to edit their story about you. You want to occupy a certain role in their narrative. Buddhism calls this clinging to views, clinging to how things should be seen. But you cannot control someone else's mind. You can influence it sometimes, but you cannot own it. Their mind is their karma, their conditioning, their responsibility. When you release control over that, you reclaim energy. You stop wasting hours trying to correct someone who is committed to misunderstanding. You stop draining yourself in conversations that go in circles. You learn when to speak and when to let silence protect your peace. And silence, used wisely, is not abandonment. It is self-respect. There is also a deeper layer. Sometimes you want to be understood because you want your pain to be witnessed. You want someone to acknowledge what you went through. This is a real need. Buddhism does not deny it, but it shows a path where you can witness your own pain too. You can say inwardly, "This hurt me." You can honor your own experience without waiting for someone else to validate it. You can hold yourself with compassion. You can let your own awareness be the space where your pain is allowed to exist. This is one of the most healing things a human can learn, because waiting for the wrong person to understand you is like waiting for rain from a locked sky. You can waste years. Buddhism teaches you to stop begging for water and start becoming a well. This does not mean you stop seeking healthy connection. You can still choose people who listen. You can still build relationships where understanding flows both ways. But you stop turning understanding into a requirement for survival. You stop making it the condition for peace. You also begin to see that misunderstanding can be a teacher. It shows you where you are still attached. It shows you where your ego still needs confirmation. It shows you where your fear still wants protection. Each misunderstanding becomes a mirror, not a mirror of your worth, but a mirror of your clinging. And as clinging reduces, freedom grows. There is a quiet moment that comes when you no longer chase being understood. It feels like stepping out of a loud room into fresh air. Your mind stops rehearsing speeches. Your chest stops tightening over other people's opinions. You speak less, but your words become more honest. You explain less, but you become more real. You stop performing your goodness. You simply live it. And when someone misunderstands you, you may still feel a sting. You are human, but the sting passes through instead of setting up a home inside you. This is the kind of freedom that makes sleep easier, because so much insomnia is not caused by the day itself, but by the mind replaying how it was seen, how it was judged, what it should have said, what it needs to prove. As this teaching settles, there is nothing left to prove tonight. You do not need to be understood by everyone. You do not need to win every mental argument. You do not need to correct every assumption. You only need to be aligned with your own truth and gentle with your own heart. When the urge to be understood loosens its grip, another habit of the mind quietly reveals itself. It shows up in unfinished conversations, unanswered messages, relationships that ended without explanation, questions that never found a reply. It's the tension of something left open, the feeling that peace is waiting on one final answer. Many people don't notice how much energy they spend carrying these open loops, but the body remembers. The mind circles them at night. The heart tightens around what was never resolved. There is a deep emotional pull toward closure. It feels like a natural need, almost like hunger. The mind believes that if it could just know why something happened, or what someone really meant, or how things would have turned out, then everything inside would finally settle. But Buddhism offers a perspective that goes against this instinct. It teaches that the craving for closure often creates more suffering than the lack of answers itself. From early on, we are taught to finish things. Stories have endings. Problems have solutions. Effort leads to resolution. This conditioning trains the mind to see open endings as threats. Something unfinished feels wrong, unsafe, incomplete. The nervous system treats uncertainty like danger, even when no real harm is present. So the mind keeps searching, replaying, analyzing, hoping to close the loop. But many of life's most impactful experiences do not end neatly. People leave without explanation, love fades without a clear reason, opportunities disappear without warning, loss arrives without permission. And no amount of thinking can rewind these moments or rewrite them into something more satisfying. When peace is tied to answers, peace becomes rare. Buddhism does not deny the discomfort of unresolved endings. It simply points out that insisting on resolution is a form of resistance. The mind is saying, this should make sense, when life is not obligated to explain itself. That resistance keeps the wound open long after the event has passed. The desire for closure is often disguised as wisdom. It sounds thoughtful, it sounds mature. But underneath, it is frequently a demand for control. The mind wants to finalize the story so it can feel safe again. It wants certainty so it can rest. Yet, certainty is one of the rarest things in existence. When you look closely, closure is not something the world gives you. It is something the mind constructs. Even when answers are provided, the mind often finds new questions. Even when explanations are offered, doubt remains. The relief from closure is usually temporary, because the real issue was never the missing information. It was the discomfort of not knowing. Buddhism teaches that peace does not come from resolving every question. It comes from learning how to live without answers. This is not resignation, it is maturity. It is the ability to stay present without demanding that reality tidy itself for your comfort. Many people believe that if they understood the past better, they could finally move on. But the past cannot be fully understood because it was shaped by countless conditions, many of which are invisible. Even the people involved often don't fully understand their own actions. Expecting a complete explanation is like expecting a map of a city that is still being built. The craving for closure also keeps the self locked in the past. The mind keeps returning to the same scene, hoping that this time it will feel different. But each return reinforces the habit. The memory becomes stronger, not weaker. Buddhism teaches that attention feeds experience. What you repeatedly revisit gains power, regardless of whether it brings relief. Unresolved endings often hurt because they leave identity questions behind. What did that mean about me? Was I not enough? Did I do something wrong? The mind tries to use closure to protect the self-image. It wants a clear verdict. But life does not operate like a courtroom. There is no final ruling that will make everything feel justified. When closure is not available, people often blame themselves. They fill the silence with self-criticism. Buddhism gently redirects this habit. It teaches that not everything is personal. Many events happen because of timing, circumstance, fear, confusion, or forces beyond individual intention. Carrying unanswered questions as self-blame only deepens suffering. There is also a subtle hope hidden inside the search for closure. The hope that an answer might undo the pain. That knowing would somehow reverse what was felt. But knowledge cannot change what has already passed through the body. The pain happened, the loss happened, the disappointment happened. No explanation can erase that. This does not mean understanding has no value. Understanding can bring insight. It can inform future choices. But when understanding becomes a condition for peace, it becomes a prison. Buddhism encourages a different relationship with not knowing, one that does not rush to fill the space. The Buddha spoke often about impermanence, but impermanence is not only about things ending, it is also about things never fully completing. Life is a series of movements, not closed shapes. When the mind insists on finished forms, it fights the nature of experience. Learning to rest with unresolved endings takes practice. The first step is noticing the urge. The mind reaches for answers automatically. It tries to solve emotional discomfort like a puzzle. When you notice this, you can pause. You can feel the discomfort without turning it into a problem that needs fixing. This discomfort often lives in the body. A heaviness in the chest, a tightness in the throat, a restlessness that won't settle. Buddhism teaches that you don't need to explain these sensations to let them pass. You only need to allow them. Sensations rise and fall when they are not fed by thought. Another layer of closure craving comes from the belief that unresolved endings block happiness. People tell themselves, "I can't move forward until this is resolved." But this belief keeps life on hold. Buddhism invites you to see that life continues whether you are ready or not. Waiting for perfect emotional resolution delays living. Unanswered questions can coexist with peace. This is one of the most radical teachings. Peace is not a state where everything makes sense. It is a state where the need for sense-making relaxes, where the mind stops demanding coherence and allows mystery. Many spiritual traditions try to explain suffering. Buddhism does something different. It teaches how to be with suffering without explanation. It does not promise meaning for every loss. It offers freedom from the need for meaning. This approach feels uncomfortable at first, especially for minds trained to analyze. But over time, it becomes deeply relieving. You stop exhausting yourself with endless inner dialogue. You stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to move on. You stop reopening wounds just to check if they still hurt. Letting go of closure does not mean forgetting. It means remembering without reopening. The memory remains, but the emotional charge softens. The story loses its sharp edges. This happens naturally when the mind stops poking at it. There is also humility in this practice. Admitting that you may never fully understand something is not weakness. It is honesty. Buddhism sees wisdom not as having answers, but as knowing the limits of knowing. Some people fear that without closure, they will repeat the same mistakes. But learning does not require full understanding. Experience teaches on its own. The body remembers what hurts. Awareness grows without explanations. There is a quiet strength that develops when you stop chasing endings. You become less dependent on other people's words, less dependent on final conversations, less dependent on one last explanation. You stop tying your peace to events that already happened. This strength does not harden you. It softens you. Because when you stop fighting the past, energy returns to the present. You notice small moments again, you breathe more deeply, you sleep more easily. Buddhism teaches that closure is often a mental story added after the fact. Life happens first, meaning comes later, if at all. Trying to force meaning creates tension. Allowing meaning to arise naturally creates space. Over time, the mind learns that it can survive uncertainty, that unanswered questions are not fatal, that not knowing is not the same as being lost. This realization changes how you meet future experiences. You become less panicked when things are unclear, less desperate for resolution. There is also compassion in letting go of closure. Compassion for yourself, who did the best you could with the awareness you had. Compassion for others, who acted from their own confusion. Holding this compassion does not require answers, it only requires presence. Unresolved endings often feel heavy because they are carried alone. Buddhism teaches that awareness itself can hold them. You do not need to solve them to release them. You only need to stop gripping them. As this practice deepens, the mind becomes quieter, not empty, but less demanding. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer insist on conclusions. There is room for ambiguity, room for silence, room for life to remain unfinished. Peace begins to feel less like an achievement and more like a resting place, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing needs to be. When the mind learns to rest without answers, another subtle tension begins to surface. It does not come from the past anymore, and it does not come from other people. It comes from the future, from an image you carry quietly, an image of who you are supposed to become. This image follows you through your days, shaping your effort, your disappointment, and even your sense of worth. And the closer you look at it, the clearer it becomes that this image has been asking more from you than it has ever given back. There is a quiet pressure many people live under. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand loudly. It simply whispers, not yet calm enough, not yet healed enough, not yet wise enough, not yet successful enough, not yet the version of yourself that deserves rest. This pressure is created by the fantasy of a future self, a version of you that exists only in thought, but somehow holds authority over your present life. This future self is always better, more disciplined, more peaceful, more confident, less reactive, less flawed. And while it may feel motivating at first, over time it becomes a source of deep dissatisfaction. Because no matter how much you grow, the fantasy moves ahead. The finish line keeps shifting. Liberation is always postponed. Buddhism teaches that this clinging to a future identity is a form of suffering that often goes unnoticed. It feels like ambition. It feels like self-improvement. It feels responsible, but underneath, it is a refusal to be with what is here now, a subtle rejection of the present self. The mind tells itself, once I become that person, then I can relax. But that day never arrives, because the habit of becoming replaces the ability to be. The present moment is treated as a problem to fix rather than a place to live. This fantasy of a future self is built from comparison. You compare yourself to others, to ideals, to spiritual images, to past versions of yourself, to imagined outcomes, and each comparison creates distance from who you are now. Buddhism points out that this distance is where suffering grows. There is nothing wrong with growth. Buddhism does not teach stagnation, but it draws a clear line between growth and self-rejection. Growth happens naturally when awareness deepens. Self-rejection happens when you believe you are not enough as you are. Clinging to a future self turns life into a waiting room. You are always preparing, always working towards something that feels more real than the moment you are in. Joy becomes conditional. Peace becomes delayed. You tell yourself you will rest later, be kind to yourself later, accept yourself later. This habit also distorts effort. Effort becomes heavy because it is tied to identity. You are not just practicing, learning, or healing. You are trying to become someone, and when progress feels slow, the mind turns harsh. You criticize yourself. You feel behind. You feel like you are failing at becoming. Buddhism teaches that the self you are trying to perfect is not a solid thing. It is a collection of habits, thoughts, emotions, and conditions that are constantly changing. Building your peace on a future version of this shifting process is unstable from the start. The fantasy future self often looks calm, confident, and complete. But it is an illusion created by the mind's tendency to idealize what is not here. The present self, by contrast, feels messy, inconsistent, unfinished. The mind prefers the fantasy because it feels clean. But life is not clean, life is alive. When you chase the future self, you subtly turn away from your current experience. You don't fully listen to your body. You don't fully feel your emotions. You rush through moments because they are only steps towards something else. Buddhism invites you to notice how much of life you miss while preparing to live it. This attachment also creates fear, because if your worth is tied to who you will become, then any obstacle feels threatening. Setbacks feel like proof that you are failing at becoming yourself. Aging feels dangerous. Mistakes feel heavy. You start managing your image instead of meeting your experience. There is also exhaustion in this. Carrying an ideal self is tiring. You are constantly measuring, constantly adjusting, constantly reminding yourself who you should be. The mind never fully rests because it is always looking forward. Buddhism offers a radical alternative. Liberation is not found in becoming someone else. It is found in seeing clearly who is already here without adding or subtracting. This does not mean celebrating harmful behavior or ignoring growth. It means ending the war with your present nature. It means allowing yourself to be incomplete without turning incompleteness into a problem. When you stop clinging to the future self, effort changes quality. You still act, you still learn. But the effort is lighter. It is no longer fueled by self-criticism. It is guided by curiosity and care rather than fear of not being enough. The Buddha taught that suffering comes from attachment, and this includes attachment to identities that do not yet exist. When you release this attachment, the present moment becomes sufficient. Not perfect, but sufficient, and sufficiency brings peace. The fantasy future self also interferes with compassion. When you believe you must fix yourself before you are worthy, you apply the same standard to others. You become impatient with their flaws. You wait for them to change before offering full acceptance. Letting go of the future self softens this judgment. Another subtle cost of this attachment is how it delays gratitude. You overlook what you already are capable of. You ignore the resilience you have built. You discount the wisdom gained through pain, because your attention is locked on what is missing. Buddhism teaches that the present self is not an obstacle to awakening. It is the doorway. Every emotion, every reaction, every limitation is material for awareness. When you stop trying to escape who you are, you can finally learn from who you are. There is also honesty in this surrender. You stop pretending you know exactly who you should become. You accept uncertainty about your path. You allow life to shape you instead of forcing yourself into a predetermined mold. This surrender can feel scary at first. Without the future self, the mind feels unstructured. It asks, then who am I? Buddhism answers gently, you are what is happening now, not a label, not a destination, a process unfolding. When this understanding deepens, self-worth stops being a project. You no longer need to earn rest. You no longer postpone peace. You stop treating yourself as a problem to solve. This also changes how you relate to time. The future loses its grip. The present gains depth. You notice small things again: breath, sensation, silence. These were always available, but the fantasy future self kept pulling attention away. Letting go of who you think you should become does not erase direction. It removes rigidity. You move forward without dragging an image behind you. You adapt more easily. You suffer less when plans change. There is a quiet relief in no longer needing to become. The mind softens, the body relaxes. You are allowed to arrive in your own life, not as a finished product, but as a living being. This surrender does not happen all at once. The fantasy future self has been rehearsed for years. It returns out of habit. Buddhism does not demand that you destroy it. It asks you to notice it. Each time you see it and do not obey it, its grip weakens. Gradually, effort and peace stop competing. You can grow without self-rejection. You can change without believing you are broken. You can move forward without abandoning yourself. And in this way, liberation stops being something ahead of you. It becomes something you can feel now, quietly, in the simple act of no longer demanding that you be someone else. As the pressure to become someone else begins to fade, another force quietly reveals itself. It doesn't live in the future as an ideal self, and it doesn't live in the past as unanswered questions. It lives in the space between people. It hides inside care, inside hope, inside love itself. It feels reasonable. It feels kind. Yet it tightens the heart and strains connection in ways that are rarely spoken about. This is the weight of expectation. There is a certain discomfort that arises not from conflict, but from anticipation. From waiting, from the silent belief that someone should act a certain way, feel a certain thing, or respond on a certain timeline. Expectations often arrive dressed as concern. They sound like, I just want what's best, or they should know by now, or after everything I've done, this isn't too much to ask. But beneath these thoughts is a subtle attempt to shape reality so it feels safer, more predictable, more comforting to the self. Buddhism looks at expectation not as a moral failure, but as a form of control. Not loud control, not obvious domination, but quiet pressure placed on people and moments to be different from what they are. This pressure creates tension long before any words are spoken. It is felt in the body, in the tightening of the jaw, in the holding of breath, in the disappointment that appears before anything has actually gone wrong. Expectations poison joy because they pull attention away from what is happening and place it on what should be happening. The present moment becomes insufficient. It is measured against an internal script. And whenever reality fails to match the script, suffering appears. Even positive expectations carry this weight. Expecting someone to be supportive, grateful, loving, or understanding feels justified. After all, these are good qualities. But when these expectations become demands, they stop being loving. They become conditions, and conditions quietly replace freedom. When you expect someone to behave a certain way, you are no longer meeting them as they are. You are meeting your idea of who they should be. This creates distance even in closeness. Conversations become loaded. Small interactions carry unspoken tests. You begin watching not to connect but to confirm. This is the hidden violence of expectation. It does not leave bruises, it leaves tension. It creates an atmosphere where people feel evaluated rather than welcomed, where love feels conditional even when no one intends it to be. Buddhism teaches that all expectations are rooted in craving. Craving for comfort, craving for reassurance, craving for control over uncertainty. And while craving often feels protective, it actually increases vulnerability. Because the more you expect, the more you are exposed to disappointment. Disappointment is not caused by what others do. It is caused by the gap between expectation and reality. Remove the expectation, and the disappointment has nothing to land on. This does not mean you stop caring or hoping. Hope can be gentle. Expectation is rigid. Hope allows room for variation. Expectation does not. Hope says, I would like this. Expectation says, this must happen for me to be okay. In relationships, expectations often go unspoken. This makes them even more powerful. The other person may not know what is being asked of them, but they feel the pressure anyway. They sense disapproval. They feel they are falling short, even without knowing why. Over time, this erodes intimacy. Many conflicts are not about actions, but about unmet expectations that were never communicated clearly. One person feels hurt, the other feels confused. Both feel misunderstood. Buddhism teaches that clarity begins not with demanding change, but with examining the expectations themselves. Where did they come from? Were they learned? Were they inherited? Were they shaped by fear rather than wisdom? Expectations often come from the fantasy of control, the belief that if people behave in certain ways, pain can be avoided. But pain is not so easily managed. People are not machines. Emotions are not switches. Life does not follow scripts. When expectations are placed on yourself, the damage is internal. You measure your worth by productivity, calmness, success, or progress. You punish yourself for being human. This creates inner violence that feels like motivation but functions as pressure. Buddhism teaches that kindness toward oneself begins with releasing expectations of perfection. Growth happens through awareness, not self-coercion. When expectations soften, effort becomes sustainable. You act from care instead of fear. There is also an expectation that suffering should make sense, that healing should be linear, that progress should be visible. These expectations turn natural fluctuations into personal failures. When you expect constant improvement, normal setbacks feel catastrophic. Letting go of expectation does not mean lowering standards or abandoning values. It means separating values from demands. You can value honesty without expecting it perfectly. You can value love without demanding it constantly. You can value growth without forcing it. This distinction changes everything. Expectations also shape how you listen. When you expect someone to agree, you stop hearing what they are actually saying. When you expect gratitude, you miss genuine expression. When you expect appreciation, you overlook quiet presence. The moment becomes filtered through desire. Buddhism encourages direct contact with reality. This means meeting people as they are today, not as they were yesterday, or as you hope they will be tomorrow. It means allowing moments to unfold without immediately evaluating them. This is difficult because expectations often feel like investments. You have put time, effort, love, sacrifice into something, and you expect a return. When it doesn't come, resentment builds. Buddhism does not deny this pain. It asks you to notice how attachment to outcomes keeps the pain alive. Giving without expectation is not self-erasure. It is freedom. It does not mean allowing harm or disrespect. Boundaries are still necessary, but boundaries are clear and clean. Expectations are heavy and silent. A boundary says, "This is what I need to stay healthy." An expectation says, "You should already know what I need." One protects, the other controls. There is also a deep cultural conditioning around expectation. Society teaches timelines, achievements, milestones. You expect yourself and others to follow these paths. When life deviates, anxiety appears. Buddhism teaches that life does not owe you a schedule. When expectations drop, gratitude becomes possible. Not forced gratitude, real gratitude. You notice what is actually given instead of focusing on what is missing. You receive without calculating. This softens the heart. Expectation also blocks forgiveness. You expect people to know better, to act better, to heal faster. When they don't, anger stays alive. Buddhism teaches forgiveness not as forgetting, but as releasing the demand that the past be different. There is humility in letting go of expectation. You admit that you do not fully know what is best. You accept that others are walking paths shaped by conditions you cannot see. This humility creates space for compassion. Expectations are also linked to identity. You expect yourself to live up to an image. You expect others to treat you according to a role. When these identities are threatened, suffering arises. Buddhism teaches that identity itself is fluid. Releasing rigid roles reduces conflict. When expectation loosens, joy becomes simpler. You are not constantly checking whether the moment meets your criteria. You allow pleasant experiences to be pleasant without demanding they last. You allow neutral moments to be neutral without turning them into problems. This does not mean life becomes perfect. It means you stop adding extra suffering on top of what already exists. In relationships, this creates warmth. People feel safer around you because they are not being measured constantly. Conversations feel lighter. Silence feels less threatening. Presence becomes enough. Letting go of expectation also protects your energy. You stop wasting emotional resources on disappointment. You stop rehearsing grievances. You stop carrying resentment that was born from unmet assumptions. Buddhism teaches that peace grows when control dissolves. Expectation is one of the most socially acceptable forms of control. It hides behind good intentions, but its impact is felt deeply. When you see this clearly, expectations begin to soften on their own. Not because you force them away, but because you understand their cost. You see how they tighten the body, how they strain the heart, how they quietly poison joy. And in that understanding, something gentler takes their place. Acceptance, not passive acceptance, but honest presence. The willingness to meet life as it is, without demanding that it perform. This presence is not dramatic, it is quiet. It feels like space in the chest, like breath moving freely, like relationships that breathe instead of strain. There is no need to end this insight or turn it into a rule. It simply settles, and as it settles, the grip of expectation loosens, allowing connection, effort, and joy to arise without violence, without pressure, without control. As expectations soften and the pressure placed on people and moments begins to ease, attention naturally turns inward. Something subtle comes into view. Even when expectations are released, even when the future self loosens its hold, there is still a deep fatigue many people carry. a tiredness that doesn't come from laziness, but from trying, from striving, from putting in effort again and again, and secretly believing that this effort is something you own, something that defines you, something you must carry on your back. There is a quiet emotional weight tied to effort, a belief that says, "I tried so hard," and hidden inside it, another voice that asks, "Why wasn't it enough?" This is where suffering becomes personal, not because effort failed, but because effort was claimed as identity. Buddhism approaches effort in a way that feels unfamiliar to many modern minds. It does not deny effort. It does not discourage discipline, care, or persistence, but it gently removes ownership from effort. It teaches that effort happens, but it does not belong to a solid me. And this single shift has the power to dissolve burnout and self-blame at their roots. Most people are taught that effort equals worth. The harder you try, the better you are. If you succeed, it's because you earned it. If you fail, it's because you didn't try hard enough. This logic feels fair, but it places an enormous burden on the self. Every outcome becomes a personal verdict. When effort is owned, exhaustion becomes moral. Rest feels undeserved. Stopping feels like weakness. And when things don't work out, the mind turns against itself. I should have done more. I should have known better. I failed. Buddhism dismantles this entire framework by questioning the idea of ownership itself. It asks a simple but unsettling question: where did your effort come from? Effort arises from conditions, from upbringing, from health, from opportunity, from inspiration, from support, from timing, from countless factors you did not create. Even the desire to try comes from causes outside your control. Seeing this clearly loosens the grip of pride and shame at the same time. This does not mean effort is meaningless. It means effort is impersonal. When you believe effort belongs to you, success inflates the ego and failure crushes it. When you see effort as a natural response to conditions, success becomes gratitude and failure becomes learning. The emotional extremes soften. Burnout often comes from carrying effort like a burden that must prove something. People push themselves not just to do, but to justify their existence. Effort becomes a defense against feeling unworthy. This is why rest feels uncomfortable. The mind whispers that stopping means losing value. Buddhism teaches that effort does not need to justify you. You are not a project that must be earned. Effort is simply an action arising in the present moment, shaped by intention and circumstance, not by identity. There is a deep relief in this. When effort is no longer yours, you stop gripping it so tightly. You still show up, you still care, but you stop demanding that effort protect you from failure or define your worth. Self-blame loses its foundation when ownership dissolves. Blame requires a solid self to attach to. When you see that actions arise from conditions, responsibility remains, but punishment fades. You correct what needs correcting without turning it into an attack on who you are. This is a crucial distinction. Buddhism does not remove responsibility. It removes cruelty. You can acknowledge mistakes without collapsing. You can adjust behavior without carrying shame. Effort becomes flexible instead of rigid. Another source of burnout is the belief that effort must always be visible, that progress must be measurable, that trying only counts if it produces results others can see. This creates constant pressure. Buddhism teaches that effort can be quiet, it can be internal, it can be unseen, and it still matters. Sometimes the most sincere effort produces no immediate outcome. Seeds take time, conditions shift. Expecting instant results turns effort into strain. When ownership is released, patience becomes possible. You allow effort to unfold without demanding proof. There is also a hidden comparison embedded in effort ownership. You measure your effort against others. They tried less and got more. I tried more and got less. This comparison breeds resentment. Buddhism reminds you that conditions are never equal. Comparing effort is comparing illusions. When effort is seen as part of a larger flow of cause and effect, comparison loses meaning. You focus on what is appropriate now, not on how it measures up. Releasing ownership over effort also changes motivation. Motivation based on fear leads to exhaustion. Motivation based on care sustains itself. When you are no longer trying to prove something, energy returns. Action becomes lighter. This does not mean you stop pushing through difficulty when needed. It means you stop pushing against yourself. You recognize fatigue as information, not failure. You listen to the body instead of overriding it in the name of discipline. Buddhism teaches that effort must be balanced. Too little effort leads to stagnation. Too much leads to tension. Wise effort feels steady, not frantic. It adapts to conditions instead of forcing them. Ownership makes effort rigid. You feel you must keep going because you started, because stopping would mean admitting defeat. Buddhism invites you to respond to the present moment instead of clinging to past effort. There is also freedom from pride in this teaching. Pride ties identity to effort. I am someone who works hard. When this identity is threatened, fear appears. Releasing ownership allows you to work hard without needing recognition. Effort becomes service, not self-definition. This freedom extends to helping others. When you don't own effort, you don't take responsibility for outcomes that are not yours to control. You offer support without carrying guilt if it doesn't fix everything. This protects compassion from turning into exhaustion. Many people burn out because they believe effort should save others. When it doesn't, they feel they failed. Buddhism teaches that you can contribute without controlling. You can care without owning results. This teaching also softens regret. Regret often comes from replaying effort and believing it should have led somewhere else. When ownership is released, regret turns into reflection. You learn without punishing yourself. There is humility here too. You recognize that effort is not entirely personal, that grace, luck, timing, and support play roles. This humility is not diminishing, it is grounding. It keeps you connected to reality. When effort is no longer owned, rest becomes natural. Not earned, not justified. Rest becomes part of the cycle of action. You stop treating rest as a reward and start treating it as maintenance. This changes how you relate to time. You stop racing against an invisible clock. You stop fearing pauses. You allow recovery. Burnout loses its grip because you are no longer at war with your limits. Buddhism also teaches that effort must be aligned. Effort without awareness becomes mechanical. Awareness without effort becomes passive. When ownership is released, effort and awareness work together. You act with intention, but you stay open to change. This alignment brings a sense of ease, even in difficulty. You can work hard without feeling crushed. You can try sincerely without collapsing when things don't go as planned. Another subtle shift happens in how you talk to yourself. The inner voice becomes kinder, not indulgent, but honest. You stop using effort as a weapon against yourself. You stop saying, "I should have tried harder," and start asking, "What was possible given the conditions?" This question opens space instead of closing it. Releasing ownership over effort also dissolves the fear of stopping. Many people keep going long past what is healthy because they fear what stopping says about them. When effort is no longer identity, stopping becomes a choice, not a threat. You begin to trust that you are still worthy even when you rest, even when you fail, even when you change direction. This trust is deeply stabilizing. In Buddhism, freedom is not found in doing more. It is found in clinging less. When you stop clinging to effort as proof of self, you free yourself from an endless cycle of strain. Action continues, care continues, but the weight lifts. Effort becomes something that flows through you, not something you carry. And in that flow, burnout has no solid ground to stand on. Self-blame loses its voice. What remains is simple participation in life, moment by moment, without ownership, without punishment, without exhaustion. As effort becomes lighter and no longer feels like something you must carry or defend, attention naturally shifts to something closely connected. Even when you release ownership over what you do, there can still be a quiet tension tied to who you are believed to be. Not who you actually are in your private moments, but the role you occupy in other people's minds. This role can feel fixed, heavy, and surprisingly hard to step out of. And much suffering grows here, unnoticed, accepted as normal, even as it slowly limits how freely you can live. There is a subtle pressure that comes from being seen a certain way, a pressure to remain consistent with an image others have formed. You may not consciously agree with that image, but you feel responsible for it anyway. You act carefully, you speak cautiously, you avoid certain choices because they might confuse or disappoint the story someone else is telling about you. This is identity suffering. It does not come from pain itself. It comes from attachment to definition, from believing that who you are must make sense within other people's narratives. From early in life, you are given roles: the responsible one, the strong one, the quiet one, the smart one, the difficult one, the helper, the disappointment. These labels often arrive before you understand yourself, and once they settle, they become reference points. Others relate to you through them. You begin to relate to yourself through them too. Buddhism teaches that the self is not a solid thing, but a process. Yet roles suggest solidity. They freeze you into a shape that others recognize. When you try to move beyond that shape, resistance appears. Sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, sometimes in the form of confusion, guilt, or withdrawal of approval. This creates suffering, not because the role is always negative. Even positive roles can be prisons. Being the reliable one can trap you into overgiving. Being the calm one can make you feel unable to express pain. Being the strong one can leave you alone when you need support. The role becomes a silent contract you never agreed to but feel bound by. Identity suffering grows when you believe you must protect these roles to remain safe or loved. You start managing perception. You anticipate reactions. You filter yourself to fit expectations. Over time, this creates distance from your own experience. Buddhism does not ask you to reject all roles immediately. It asks you to see them clearly. To recognize that roles exist in other people's minds, not as truths, but as interpretations. Each person holds a version of you shaped by their needs, fears, and history. These versions often contradict each other. One person sees you as generous, another sees you as weak. One sees you as distant, another sees you as overwhelming. Trying to live up to all these versions is impossible, yet many people try. And in trying, they fracture themselves. This is where suffering deepens, not because others misunderstand you, but because you take responsibility for their understanding. The Buddhist exit from this prison begins with a simple recognition. You do not live inside other people's stories. Their stories live inside them. When you internalize someone else's narrative about you, you begin to act from it. You make choices to maintain it. You fear disrupting it. You become careful in ways that feel like self-protection, but slowly turn into self-erasure. Letting go of the role you play does not mean becoming reckless or indifferent. It means withdrawing the belief that you must perform an identity to deserve peace. There is fear here, because roles often come with belonging. When you loosen them, you may worry about losing connection. You may fear disappointing people. Buddhism does not deny this fear. It simply points out that connection built on performance is fragile. It depends on consistency, not authenticity. When identity is loosened, relationships may shift. Some people feel uncomfortable when you change, not because you are wrong, but because their story no longer fits. This discomfort is not your failure. It is the natural result of growth. Buddhism teaches that clinging to identity is a cause of suffering because identity is always incomplete. No role can capture the fullness of a living being. When you identify with a role, you shrink to fit it. When you release it, you return to being fluid. This fluidity can feel unfamiliar. Without a role, the mind asks, "Then who am I?" Buddhism does not rush to answer. It allows the question to remain open, because the moment you fix an answer, it becomes another role. Instead of defining yourself, you learn to experience yourself. Sensations, emotions, thoughts arise and pass. None of them need to be defended as who I am. This reduces the urge to control how you are seen. Another layer of identity suffering comes from moral roles. Being the good one, the reasonable one, the mature one. These roles often hide self-suppression. You swallow anger, you avoid conflict, you take responsibility for others' feelings. You stay silent when something hurts because speaking might damage the image. Buddhism teaches that peace does not require being perceived as good. It requires honesty with yourself. When goodness becomes performance, it stops being compassionate. It becomes control. Releasing the role allows truth to move. You speak when something matters. You rest when you are tired. You say no without rehearsing apologies. This may surprise others. It may disappoint them. But it brings you closer to yourself. There is also grief in this process. Grief for the time spent maintaining roles that never fully fit. Grief for the parts of yourself that were hidden to keep peace. Buddhism allows this grief. It does not rush you past it. Grief is part of letting go. Identity suffering also appears when you're attached to being seen a certain way in conflict. You want to be right. You want to be justified. You want others to recognize your intentions. When they don't, the pain intensifies. Buddhism teaches that the need to be seen correctly is another form of attachment. You can act with integrity without needing others to confirm it. When you release the role of being the justified one, conflict loses some of its power. You stop arguing to protect identity. You start responding to what is actually happening. This does not mean accepting false blame. It means separating self-worth from reputation. You correct what needs correcting, and you let go of the rest. There is freedom in this. You no longer feel watched all the time. You no longer feel the need to be consistent for the sake of image. You allow yourself to change your mind, to grow, to contradict past versions of yourself. Buddhism teaches that change is not betrayal, it is nature. Clinging to roles is clinging to something already dissolving. Another source of suffering is when others project their unmet needs onto you. You become the listener, the fixer, the emotional container. These roles can feel meaningful at first, but over time, they drain you. You may feel guilty stepping back because the role has become expected. Letting go here is not abandonment, it is honesty. You recognize that you cannot be everything for everyone. You allow others to take responsibility for their own lives. This can feel uncomfortable, but it restores balance. Identity suffering is also reinforced by memory. People remember you as you were, not as you are becoming. They relate to old versions. When you act differently, they may resist. Buddhism teaches that you are not obligated to remain who you were for someone else's comfort. This teaching is deeply compassionate. It frees you from living in someone else's past. When you stop clinging to roles, the mind becomes quieter. You stop rehearsing how to present yourself. You stop anticipating judgment. You stop filtering your responses excessively. Life feels more direct. This does not mean you lose empathy. You still care how actions affect others, but you stop carrying their interpretations as your responsibility. There is a subtle joy in this freedom. You laugh more easily. You speak more simply. You are less strategic. You show up as you are that day, not as who you are supposed to be. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not about becoming invisible or detached. It is about no longer being trapped by concepts, including concepts of self. When roles loosen, compassion deepens. You see others as trapped in their own stories. You stop taking their projections personally. You respond with clarity instead of defense. This clarity does not come from indifference, it comes from stability. You know who you are not by definition, but by presence. As this understanding settles, there is less fear of misunderstanding, less fear of disapproval, less fear of being miscast. You trust that you do not need to live inside anyone else's narrative to exist fully. There is nothing to prove, nothing to maintain, nothing to protect. What remains is movement, response, life unfolding without the weight of performance. And in that openness, identity suffering loosens its grip, leaving behind a quieter, more spacious way of being that does not depend on roles to feel real. As the grip of roles loosens and you no longer feel compelled to live inside other people's stories, another attachment becomes visible. It is quieter than ego, softer than ambition, and often praised rather than questioned. It lives in moments of achievement, recognition, and praise. It feels good, even healthy. Yet it binds the heart just as tightly as shame ever did. This is the attachment to credit. There is a subtle thrill when effort appears to pay off, when something works, when results arrive. When others acknowledge what you did, the body warms, the mind straightens its posture. A sense of "I did this" forms almost automatically. This feeling seems harmless, even deserved. But Buddhism asks you to look deeper, not to deny success, but to see what happens when success becomes personal. Most people are taught to release shame in failure, but very few are taught to release pride in success, and yet, both are two sides of the same attachment. Both require a solid self to cling to. Both tie your peace to outcomes. Both make life heavier than it needs to be. When you unclaim credit, you do not deny action. You do not pretend nothing happened. You simply stop turning success into identity. Success is often treated as proof. Proof that you are capable, proof that you are worthy, proof that you matter. When success becomes proof, pride becomes necessary. And when pride becomes necessary, fear quietly follows. Because what was proven can be lost. Buddhism teaches that pride and shame are siblings. Pride inflates the self, shame collapses it. But both keep you trapped in the same structure, the belief that outcomes define who you are. Unclaiming credit loosens this structure. It begins with understanding how little control you actually had, not in a dismissive way, but in an honest one. Every success arises from countless conditions: timing, support, health, opportunity, education, help from others. Even the energy to act came from causes beyond your choosing. When you see this clearly, pride softens naturally. This does not diminish your effort. It places it in context. When you cling to credit, success becomes a burden. You feel pressure to repeat it, to maintain it, to protect the image it created. You begin managing expectations, including your own. The joy of success fades quickly, replaced by anxiety about losing it. Buddhism teaches that joy tied to ownership cannot last. The moment you say, "This is mine," fear enters, because what is owned can be taken away. Unclaiming credit allows success to pass through without sticking. You appreciate it fully without gripping it. You let it warm you without letting it define you. There is also a subtle comparison that comes with claiming credit. You measure yourself against others. You feel ahead or behind, superior or inferior. Even if you never say it aloud, the mind keeps score. This scoring creates separation. It turns shared humanity into competition. When credit is unclaimed, comparison weakens. You see success as an event, not a ranking. You can celebrate others without threat. You can learn from others without envy. This is especially freeing in collaborative spaces. Many conflicts arise not from failure but from credit. Who did what? Who deserves recognition? Who contributed more? Buddhism teaches that clinging to credit poisons cooperation. It shifts focus from the work to the self. When credit is released, contribution becomes cleaner. You do what needs to be done because it matters, not because it will reflect well on you. This restores sincerity. Unclaiming credit also protects you from arrogance disguised as confidence. Confidence rooted in ownership is brittle. It needs constant reinforcement. Confidence rooted in humility is stable. It does not depend on applause. There is also a deep emotional balance created here. When you stop claiming credit, you also stop over-identifying with failure. If success is not mine, then failure is not me. This symmetry is powerful. It allows you to stay steady across changing conditions. Many people carry shame because they failed at something important. Buddhism teaches that shame requires ownership. It requires the belief that I am the failure. When ownership dissolves, shame loses its foundation. Failure becomes information, not identity. This balance is what makes effort sustainable. You can act wholeheartedly without the emotional extremes of pride and shame. You can show up fully without gambling your self-worth. Unclaiming credit does not make you passive. It makes you resilient. Another layer of this teaching involves how success is remembered. When you cling to credit, you replay achievements. You protect them in memory. You want them acknowledged again. This keeps the mind anchored in the past. Buddhism teaches that clinging to past success is just another form of attachment. Letting success go allows the mind to stay present. You do not need to carry yesterday's victories into today. Each moment stands on its own. This also softens relationships. When you stop needing credit, you stop subtly reminding others of what you've done. You stop keeping emotional ledgers. You give without expecting recognition. This makes generosity lighter. Many people feel unappreciated, not because appreciation is absent, but because credit has been claimed internally. When you believe you deserve recognition, lack of it feels painful. When you release that belief, appreciation becomes a gift rather than a requirement. Buddhism does not say recognition is wrong. It says attachment to recognition is costly. There is also freedom in anonymity, doing good without being seen, contributing without being named. Buddhism values this deeply because it purifies intention. You act because it is right, not because it enhances identity. Unclaiming credit also protects the heart when success attracts projection. Praise can distort relationships. People may idealize you, envy you, or expect more from you. When you don't own the success, these projections slide off more easily. You remain grounded. This teaching is especially important in spiritual practice. Pride in progress can be as limiting as discouragement. I am advanced. I am more aware. These thoughts create distance from others and from reality. Buddhism teaches that the moment you claim spiritual credit, practice stalls. Unclaiming credit keeps the path open. You remain a student, not a statue. There is also kindness in this practice. You acknowledge the help you received. You see the web of support that made success possible. Gratitude replaces pride. Connection replaces separation. When you unclaim credit, you stop using success to defend yourself. You no longer need achievements to feel safe. This reduces anxiety deeply. You trust that worth is not earned through performance. This trust changes how you approach challenges. You are less afraid to try, less afraid to fail, because neither outcome threatens your identity. Another quiet benefit is how this practice affects your inner dialogue. You stop congratulating or condemning yourself excessively. The mind becomes calmer, less dramatic, more focused on what is needed now. This simplicity is peaceful. Unclaiming credit does not erase satisfaction, it refines it. Satisfaction becomes quiet and content, not inflated. It does not require validation to exist. Over time, this practice builds emotional balance. You are not lifted too high by success or dropped too low by failure. You remain steady. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not found in avoiding success or failure, but in not being owned by either. When credit is released, effort becomes sincere. When pride fades, humility appears. When humility appears, compassion deepens. You see yourself and others more clearly, without distortion. There is no need to announce this shift. It does not require a declaration. It happens internally, a softening, a loosening. Success still comes and goes. Effort still happens. Outcomes still matter practically. But they no longer define you. And in that quiet unclaiming, something essential returns. Lightness, ease, a sense of being part of something larger rather than standing apart. Nothing needs to be concluded. Nothing needs to be proven. Life continues, and you move with it, contributing fully without carrying the weight of ownership, allowing both success and failure to pass through without leaving scars. As pride loosens and success no longer needs to be carried as proof, another pressure becomes easier to feel. It isn't about what you do or who you are. It's about when things should happen. A quiet impatience begins to show itself, especially around pain, around healing, around the hope that by now something inside you should be different, lighter, quieter, finished. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from looking at your own heart and thinking, why is this still here? The sadness that hasn't dissolved, the grief that returns, the fear that rises again after you thought it was gone. This suffering doesn't come from the emotion itself. It comes from the belief that healing is late. Modern life teaches schedules for everything. Progress is measured, improvement is tracked. Even inner growth is expected to follow steps, stages, timelines. When healing doesn't follow the plan, frustration sets in. The mind begins to judge the heart. I should be over this. I've done the work. Enough time has passed. These thoughts feel logical, but they quietly turn pain into failure. Buddhism offers a very different view. It teaches that inner change follows organic timing, not mental deadlines. Healing ripens the way fruit ripens. It cannot be forced. It cannot be rushed. And when it is pressured, it often slows down instead of speeding up. Detachment from emotional timing does not mean indifference to healing. It means releasing the demand that healing obey your expectations. The moment you believe an emotion should have already left, you create a second layer of suffering. The first layer is the emotion, the second is resistance. This resistance often sounds like impatience with yourself. You feel annoyed that you still feel hurt, ashamed that you're still affected, worried that something is wrong with you. Buddhism teaches that this impatience is not motivation. It is violence directed inward. Emotions arise from causes and conditions. Some of those conditions are visible, others are buried deep in memory, body, and nervous system. Time alone does not dissolve them. Awareness does, safety does, repeated gentleness does. These things cannot be scheduled. When you attach healing to a timeline, you turn recovery into a performance. You monitor progress, you evaluate moods, you scan yourself constantly for signs of improvement. This constant checking keeps attention locked on the wound. It prevents rest. Buddhism teaches that healing happens when conditions are right, not when the mind demands it. Sometimes the most healing thing is to stop watching the clock. This is difficult because the mind wants certainty. It wants reassurance that the pain will end. When it cannot get certainty, it tries to create it through timelines. In 6 months, I'll be better. By next year, this won't hurt. When those predictions fail, despair grows. The problem was never the emotion, it was the contract you made with time. Detachment from emotional timing allows emotions to move at their own pace. Some pass quickly, some return in waves, some transform slowly. This is not regression. It is how the nervous system releases what it could not process all at once. Buddhism understands this deeply. It does not see repeated emotion as failure. It sees it as continuation. Each return brings a slightly different texture, a little less intensity, a little more space. This subtle change is missed when you are busy judging progress. Another source of suffering comes from comparing your healing to others. Someone else moved on faster. Someone else seems unaffected. This comparison ignores unseen conditions. It ignores different histories, supports, and sensitivities. Buddhism teaches that comparison distorts reality and increases shame. Shame slows healing. When you believe you are behind, the body tightens. When the body tightens, emotions have less room to move. Acceptance creates space. Space allows movement. Detachment from timing does not mean passivity. You still care for yourself. You still seek support. You still practice awareness. But you stop demanding outcomes by a certain date. You stop threatening yourself with failure if you don't feel better soon. There is a deep kindness in this. You stop treating your pain as an inconvenience. You treat it as communication. Something in you is asking for attention, not pressure. Buddhism teaches that patience is not waiting. It is allowing. Allowing the present experience to be what it is without adding urgency. This kind of patience is active. It requires presence. It requires courage to stay with discomfort without trying to outrun it. Many people fear that if they stop pushing healing, they will get stuck. But pushing is often what keeps things stuck. Healing needs permission to unfold naturally. When you relax the deadline, the system relaxes too. Emotional timing is also influenced by safety. When the body feels safe, it releases. When it feels judged or rushed, it holds on. Detaching from timelines increases safety. There is also grief around lost time. You may feel angry that healing has taken so long, that life feels delayed. Buddhism allows this grief without turning it into blame. Time spent healing is not wasted. It is part of living. When you accept organic timing, you stop fighting the past and the future at the same time. You meet the present emotion without demanding it justify its presence. This acceptance changes your inner language. This is here replaces this shouldn't be here. That small shift reduces suffering dramatically. Detachment from emotional timing also changes how you support others. You stop pressuring them to heal faster. You stop offering timelines as comfort. You become more present. This deepens connection. Buddhism teaches that everything ripens in its own season. Seeds planted today do not bloom tomorrow. Tugging on them does not help. Trusting the process does. This trust does not come from optimism. It comes from observation, from seeing that emotions move when allowed, that pain softens when not resisted, that healing unfolds when conditions are kind. There is humility in this teaching. You admit you do not control your inner weather. You work with it instead of against it. Detachment from timing also frees you from the idea that you must feel a certain way to live fully. You stop postponing life until healing is complete. You live alongside healing. You allow joy and pain to coexist. This coexistence is powerful. It breaks the illusion that you must be finished to begin. Life continues even while wounds are tender. Buddhism does not promise quick relief. It offers deep relief. Relief from the constant pressure to be somewhere else emotionally. As this understanding settles, the heart softens toward itself. There is less judgment, less urgency, more breathing room. Emotions come and go on their own rhythm. Some linger, some return. None are mistakes. When you no longer measure healing against time, suffering loses one of its sharpest edges. What remains is the simple, honest process of being human, unfolding at a pace that does not need your approval to be right. As the pressure of emotional timing eases and you stop measuring healing against clocks and calendars, another habit becomes easier to see. Even without deadlines, the mind often tries to take charge. It doesn't just want healing to happen naturally. It wants to direct it, to manage it, to push it forward. There is effort here, but it carries tension. A belief that says, if I do enough, if I try hard enough, I can make this pain end. This belief feels responsible, it feels strong, and yet it quietly works against the very healing it seeks. There is a deep urge to fix what hurts. When pain lingers, the mind looks for solutions, techniques, practices, explanations, plans. You read, you reflect, you analyze, you revisit memories, you push yourself to feel differently. All of this can come from a sincere desire to be well. But when healing becomes something you try to control, it begins to resist. Buddhism teaches that healing is not an enemy to defeat. It is a process to allow. When you force recovery, you introduce struggle into a system that needs safety and gentleness. The nervous system does not heal under pressure, it heals under permission. Forcing recovery often looks like self-discipline. You tell yourself to move on, to be strong, to stop thinking about it. You distract yourself. You override feelings. You try to reframe pain before it has been fully felt. On the surface, this looks like progress, but underneath, the pain is still there, waiting for space. Buddhism teaches that what is not allowed to be felt does not disappear. It goes underground. It waits, and it often returns later stronger because it was never met. Control over healing is rooted in fear. Fear that pain will never end. Fear that if you stop managing it, it will overwhelm you. Fear that your suffering means something is wrong with you. This fear drives effort, but it also keeps the body in a state of alertness. Healing requires the opposite. Patience in Buddhism is not passive waiting. It is active non-interference. It is the choice to stop tightening around pain, to stop demanding that it justify its presence, to stop treating it as a problem that must be solved immediately. Trauma, grief, and loss change the nervous system. They alter how safety is perceived. Forcing recovery ignores this reality. You cannot think your way out of a body-based experience. You cannot reason your way into calm. The body heals through gradual exposure to safety, not through pressure. Buddhism understands suffering as something that arises due to causes and conditions. Healing happens when those conditions change. Effort alone cannot change all conditions. Some require time, some require rest, some require repeated gentleness. When you try to control healing, you often end up controlling yourself harshly. You judge emotions, you label reactions as setbacks, you scold yourself for not being better yet. This self-judgment adds a second wound. The original pain plus the pain of believing you are failing. Buddhist patience removes this second wound. It teaches you to meet pain without commentary, without plans, without threats. You notice what is present. You allow it to be there. You do not rush to make meaning. This creates space, and space is what allows healing to unfold. There is also a subtle pride in forcing recovery, a belief that strength means overcoming quickly. Buddhism redefines strength as staying present without resistance. True strength is the capacity to remain with discomfort without needing to dominate it. Forcing healing often involves bypassing. You try to jump to acceptance before anger has passed. You try to forgive before grief has been honored. You try to find lessons before loss has been felt. This bypassing creates confusion inside. Parts of you feel unheard. Healing stalls. Buddhist patience respects sequence. It allows each stage to arise and pass in its own time. Nothing is skipped. Nothing is rushed. This respect restores trust within yourself. Control over healing also shows up in comparison. You measure your recovery against others. You look for benchmarks. You ask how long it should take. These comparisons increase pressure and shame. Buddhism teaches that no two healing processes are the same because no two sets of conditions are the same. Another way forcing recovery delays healing is through constant monitoring. You scan yourself for symptoms. You check your emotional state. You analyze every reaction. This keeps attention fixed on pain. Attention feeds experience. The more you watch pain with urgency, the more it stays active. Buddhist patience shifts attention gently. You still notice pain, but without fixation. You allow it to exist in the background while life continues. This reduces its intensity naturally. Letting go of control over healing also means letting go of the fantasy of a final healed state. The idea that one day you will be completely untouched by what happened. Buddhism teaches that healing does not erase history, it changes your relationship to it. When you expect healing to mean never feeling pain again, every emotional wave feels like failure. When you accept that healing means increased capacity, not absence, pressure decreases. Patience also allows the body to lead. The body knows how to heal if it is not constantly interrupted. Sensations rise and fall. Tension releases in small increments. This process is subtle. Control interferes by trying to speed it up. There is also grief attached to letting go of control. Grief for the part of you that wanted to be done, that wanted relief now. Buddhism allows this grief too. It does not shame the desire to feel better. It simply asks you not to turn that desire into force. Force creates resistance. Resistance creates stagnation. Buddhist patience creates conditions for trust. Trust that your system is not broken. Trust that healing is happening even when you cannot see it. Trust that rest is productive. This trust changes how you relate to setbacks. Instead of seeing them as failures, you see them as signals, information about what still needs care. This reduces fear and allows adjustment. Letting go of control over healing does not mean abandoning support. It means choosing support that respects your pace. It means working with your system, not against it. Patience also restores dignity. You stop treating yourself like a project that must be fixed. You treat yourself like a living being recovering from impact. In Buddhism, healing is not something you achieve. It is something that happens when suffering is met with understanding. Understanding grows slowly. It cannot be commanded. As you release control, the body begins to relax. The nervous system shifts out of survival mode. This shift is where healing actually happens. There is also relief in no longer trying to manage the entire process. You stop carrying the responsibility for recovery on your shoulders. You allow help. You allow pauses. You allow uncertainty. This does not make you weaker. It makes you more aligned with reality. Letting go of control over healing also frees you from self-blame. When you accept that healing has its own intelligence, you stop accusing yourself for not progressing faster. You begin to meet each day as it is. Some days are lighter, some are heavier. Neither are mistakes. Buddhist patience teaches that healing is not linear. It moves in spirals. It revisits. It deepens. This is not regression. It is integration. When you stop forcing, energy returns. The body uses it to repair instead of defend. The mind quiets. Space opens. There is no moment where healing announces itself as complete. There is simply more ease, more capacity, more room around pain. And this happens not because you controlled it, but because you finally stopped interfering. Healing unfolds when effort gives way to patience, when pressure gives way to permission, when control gives way to trust. And in that trust, what effort could never reach begins to soften slowly, naturally, without needing your approval. As the grip on healing loosens and you stop trying to force recovery into shape, something deeper becomes visible beneath all the effort. Beneath the plans, beneath the strategies, beneath the constant managing of inner and outer life. What appears is not strength and not discipline, but a quiet tension that has been driving control all along. It is easy to miss because it often wears a respectable mask. It calls itself responsibility, but when you look closely you can feel its true source, fear. Control rarely announces itself as fear. Fear sounds weak, and most people do not want to see themselves that way. So fear changes clothes. It becomes planning, fixing, anticipating, managing, holding everything together. It becomes the belief that if you stay alert, stay on top of things, stay involved enough, nothing will fall apart. This belief feels noble. It feels adult. But Buddhism asks you to look not at how it sounds, but at how it feels in the body. Control feels tight. It feels vigilant. It feels exhausting. Buddhism does not condemn control, it diagnoses it. It looks at control not as a moral failure, but as a nervous system trying to protect itself. Control arises when something inside does not feel safe. It is an attempt to prevent pain before it arrives. Most people do not control because they want power. They control because they are afraid of loss, chaos, rejection, regret, or helplessness. Control is fear trying to do a good job. This is why letting go of control feels so threatening. It feels like stepping into danger. The mind says, if I don't manage this, something bad will happen. Buddhism does not argue with this thought. It asks you to notice how often the management itself becomes the source of suffering. When control is mistaken for responsibility, it becomes endless. There is always something else to monitor, something else to adjust, something else to prepare for. The mind never rests because danger is always imagined just ahead. True responsibility is responsive. It meets what is here. Fear-based control is anticipatory. It lives in what might happen. This difference is subtle but life-changing. Fear-based control believes that your vigilance is what keeps things from collapsing. This belief creates enormous pressure. You become the emotional manager of situations, people, and outcomes that were never fully under your command to begin with. Buddhism teaches that this pressure is unnecessary and unrealistic. Life unfolds through countless conditions. Your control is only one small factor among many. Taking responsibility for the whole outcome is not wisdom. It is fear wearing armor. This fear often begins early. Many people learned that safety depended on being careful, attentive, and responsible beyond their years. They learned that mistakes had consequences they could not afford, so they adapted. They became controllers, fixers, planners, overthinkers, not because they wanted to dominate, but because they wanted to survive. Over time, this survival strategy becomes identity. I'm just someone who thinks ahead. I like to be prepared. I'm the responsible one. These statements sound harmless, but underneath them is often a nervous system that does not trust life to unfold without constant supervision. Buddhism invites you to see that control does not eliminate fear. It maintains it. The more you control, the more evidence the mind collects that control is necessary. Let go for a moment, and anxiety spikes. The mind says, "See, this proves you must stay vigilant." This creates a loop. Fear leads to control. Control reinforces fear. Breaking this loop does not begin with force. You cannot force yourself to stop controlling. That would be control again. Buddhism offers a different entry point: curiosity. What are you afraid would happen if you stopped managing this? Often the answer is vague: something bad, something painful, something unbearable. When examined closely, this fear is usually not about the present moment. It is about memory. Past pain that was overwhelming, loss that came suddenly, chaos that felt unmanageable. Control becomes an attempt to prevent the past from repeating. But the present is not the past. Buddhism teaches that awareness allows you to respond to what is actually happening, not what you are afraid might happen again. Control also creates emotional distance. When you are busy managing, you are not fully present. You are watching life instead of participating in it. This reduces joy. It flattens experience. Even pleasant moments feel tense because part of you is waiting for them to end. Buddhism does not ask you to abandon responsibility. It asks you to distinguish responsibility from fear. Responsibility responds when needed. Fear tries to eliminate uncertainty altogether. Uncertainty cannot be eliminated. It can only be tolerated. This tolerance is a skill. It grows gradually. Each time you loosen control slightly and notice that you survive, trust increases. Not blind trust, but embodied trust, the kind that lives in the body, not in ideas. Fear-based control often hides in care for others. You monitor loved ones. You worry constantly. You intervene quickly. You take on emotional labor that was never asked for. This feels loving, but it often carries anxiety. Buddhism teaches that love, rooted in fear, becomes suffocating, even when intentions are good. True care respects autonomy. It allows others to have their own process. It offers support without trying to manage outcomes. This is only possible when fear is acknowledged instead of disguised as responsibility. Control also shows up in morality. You believe that being vigilant, correct, and careful will protect you from judgment or punishment. Buddhism teaches that morality practiced from fear is brittle. Morality practiced from wisdom is flexible and kind. When fear drives control, mistakes feel catastrophic. There is little room for learning. The inner voice becomes harsh. You punish yourself for not foreseeing everything. This self-punishment is fear turned inward. Buddhism replaces this with understanding. Understanding that you are human, that you cannot anticipate everything, that being alive includes risk. Fear behind control also affects decision-making. You avoid choices that feel uncertain, even if they are aligned. You stay in familiar discomfort because it feels safer than unknown possibility. Control convinces you that predictability is safety. But Buddhism teaches that clinging to predictability creates stagnation. Growth requires stepping into uncertainty with awareness, not with blind optimism, but with openness. When you begin to see control as fear, compassion naturally arises, not just for yourself, but for others. You notice how many people are driven by unacknowledged fear. You stop taking their controlling behavior personally. You see the tension underneath. This compassion does not mean compliance. You can set boundaries without hostility. You can refuse control without attacking the person behind it. Seeing fear clearly also changes how you relate to yourself in moments of anxiety. Instead of saying, "Why am I like this?" you say, "Something in me is afraid." This simple reframe softens the inner environment. Buddhism teaches that fear cannot be commanded away. It must be met with presence, met with breath, met with patience. Control tightens the body. Awareness relaxes it. When you allow fear to be felt without acting on it, control loses its urgency. You realize you can tolerate discomfort without immediately fixing it. This is a profound shift. Responsibility remains, but it becomes cleaner. You do what is appropriate now, not what you think might be needed later. You respond instead of react. You act instead of manage. This reduces exhaustion. Much of burnout comes not from doing too much, but from carrying fear while doing it. Buddhism does not promise a life without fear. It offers a life where fear no longer runs the show. As fear is acknowledged, control softens. As control softens, trust grows. Not trust that everything will go well, but trust that you can meet whatever arises without needing to dominate it. This trust feels like space in the chest, like breath moving freely, like the ability to sit with uncertainty without panic. You begin to see that many things you tried to control were never truly in danger, and the few that are dangerous cannot be controlled anyway. They can only be met. This realization does not make you careless, it makes you sane. When fear is no longer disguised as responsibility, life feels less like a constant emergency. You stop bracing for impact. You start living. Control loosens, not because you gave up responsibility, but because you finally saw what was driving it. And in seeing it clearly, fear no longer needs to pretend it is something else. As fear behind control becomes clearer, another question naturally settles into awareness. If control is released, if fear is no longer running the show, what happens when something is genuinely harmful? What happens when a situation, a relationship, or an environment continues to cause pain? Many people believe there are only two options: stay and suffer, or leave in anger. Buddhism offers a third way, quieter and far more freeing. It is the path of renunciation without bitterness. There is a deep emotional charge around walking away. Leaving is rarely neutral. It carries history, disappointment, unmet hopes, and often a sense of injustice. When harm is involved, anger feels justified. Distance feels like punishment. The mind wants to label, condemn, and prove moral clarity. And yet, Buddhism teaches that when withdrawal is fueled by hatred or superiority, suffering simply changes location. It does not end. Renunciation in Buddhism is often misunderstood. It is not rejection. It is not suppression. It is not cutting off with clenched teeth. True renunciation is a release of attachment, not an attack on what is left behind. It is stepping away because something no longer leads to peace, not because you need to prove someone wrong. Bitterness enters when leaving becomes a statement of identity. I am better than this. I would never do what they did. They are toxic. These thoughts may feel empowering at first, but they harden the heart. They keep you psychologically entangled with what you are trying to leave. The body may be gone, but the mind stays locked in conflict. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not found in winning the moral argument. It is found in no longer needing one. Renunciation without bitterness begins with clarity. You see clearly that something causes harm. Not harm in theory, but harm in lived experience. Your body tightens, your mind becomes agitated, your values are compromised, you are less present, less kind, less at ease. This clarity does not need justification, it does not need approval, it is enough. From this clarity, withdrawal can happen quietly, without speeches, without revenge, without the need to make the other side understand. Buddhism values this quietness because it protects inner peace. The less drama attached to leaving, the less residue remains. Bitterness often comes from the belief that leaving must hurt the other person as much as you were hurt. This belief ties your healing to their suffering. Buddhism teaches that this is another form of control. You are still trying to manage outcomes, just in reverse. When you renounce without bitterness, you accept that others may never understand your choice. They may misinterpret it, they may blame you, they may rewrite the story in ways that are uncomfortable. Buddhism teaches that peace does not require being understood. It requires alignment with what is wholesome. Renunciation is an act of care, not aggression. Care for your nervous system. Care for your values. Care for your capacity to remain humane. When bitterness is present, that care turns into harm, directed outward and inward. There is also grief in renunciation. Grief for what could have been. Grief for the effort you invested. Grief for the version of the future that will not happen. Buddhism does not bypass this grief. It allows it. Grief does not require blame to be valid. When bitterness is avoided, grief can move freely. It softens over time instead of hardening into resentment. Another source of bitterness is moral superiority, the belief that you are awake and others are blind, that you are evolved and they are stuck. This belief feels protective, but it isolates. It creates separation where understanding could exist. Buddhism teaches humility even in withdrawal. You recognize that conditions shape behavior, that if circumstances were different, you might act differently too. This does not excuse harm, it prevents hatred. Renunciation without bitterness also protects you from repeating patterns. When you leave with anger, you carry that anger forward. It shapes new relationships. It sharpens defenses. When you leave with clarity and compassion, you carry wisdom instead. This wisdom shows up as boundaries without hostility. You say no without attacking. You step back without slamming doors. You do not need to convince anyone that your boundary is valid. You live it. Many people fear that without bitterness they will minimize harm. Buddhism makes a clear distinction here. You can acknowledge harm fully without demonizing the person involved. You can name what was painful without turning it into a weapon. Renunciation also requires patience. The urge to leave dramatically often comes from accumulated pain. Buddhism encourages you to pause and feel that pain without turning it into action fueled by rage. This pause allows choice instead of reaction. Choice feels different in the body. It is steadier, quieter, less urgent. When you act from choice, you are less likely to regret how you left. Renunciation without bitterness also changes how you speak about the past. You stop rehearsing stories where you are the hero and the other is the villain. You tell the truth simply, "It wasn't healthy for me." This simplicity preserves dignity. Dignity is a key element here. Bitterness often feels like strength, but it erodes dignity. It makes you reactive. It keeps you hooked. Renunciation without bitterness allows you to leave with your integrity intact. This approach also affects forgiveness. Buddhism does not force forgiveness. It allows it to arise naturally when attachment falls away. Forgiveness that is demanded becomes another form of violence. Forgiveness that grows from understanding feels light. Understanding does not mean agreement. It means seeing clearly without needing to punish. Renunciation without bitterness also applies internally. You may need to step away from habits, identities, or thought patterns that harm you. Bitterness toward yourself makes this harder. You leave parts of yourself with shame and contempt. Buddhism teaches gentleness here too. You renounce what harms without hating the part of you that learned it. This internal renunciation is powerful. You stop fighting yourself. You stop treating growth as self-punishment. You choose differently because it feels better, not because you are ashamed. Another aspect of this teaching is timing. Leaving too early out of fear creates regret. Leaving too late out of hope creates exhaustion. Renunciation without bitterness requires listening carefully to your experience over time. Patterns reveal themselves. Clarity grows. When clarity is present, action feels inevitable, not dramatic. You are not pushed out by anger. You are drawn forward by peace. Buddhism teaches that some connections end not because of failure, but because conditions change. Holding on out of loyalty to the past can be as harmful as leaving in rage. Renunciation is acknowledging impermanence without resentment. There is also courage here. Walking away without hatred removes the emotional armor many people rely on. You face vulnerability. You allow sadness. You accept uncertainty. This courage deepens trust in yourself. Renunciation without bitterness does not require silence forever. You may still speak truth when needed, but your words are no longer sharp. They are clear. You are not trying to wound. You are trying to be honest. This honesty creates clean endings, even when circumstances are messy. Clean endings do not mean mutual agreement. They mean you are not carrying unfinished emotional business fueled by anger. As this practice deepens, you notice a change in your inner world. Less rumination, less replaying, less desire to prove. The mind rests more easily because it is no longer feeding conflict. Buddhism teaches that hatred is a heavy burden. Renunciation without bitterness puts that burden down. You do not have to like what happened. You do not have to approve. You simply stop carrying the extra weight. This lightness is not indifference. It is freedom. You move forward without dragging old battles behind you. You meet new situations without suspicion shaped by old wounds. You remain open but not exposed. Renunciation becomes a form of compassion. Compassion for yourself, who deserves peace. Compassion for others, who are shaped by conditions they may not fully see. Compassion for life itself, which does not always align with your hopes. Nothing needs to be justified. Nothing needs to be avenged. You step away because stepping away is kind. And in that kindness, something settles deeply. The heart remains intact. The mind grows quiet. You are no longer defined by what you left or why you left. You are simply present, free from bitterness, walking forward without carrying what no longer serves. As bitterness falls away and leaving no longer needs anger to justify it, another attachment quietly steps into view. It often appears in conversations, disagreements, and even silent inner debates. It does not shout, it insists, a pressure to correct, to clarify, to prove, to win. This pressure is familiar to almost everyone, and yet rarely questioned. It is the need to be right. There is a certain tension that arises the moment you feel misunderstood or challenged. The body tightens, the mind sharpens. Thoughts line up like arguments waiting for their turn. Even before words are spoken, something inside prepares for defense. This reaction feels automatic, even reasonable. But Buddhism invites a closer look, not at the argument itself, but at what is being protected. The compulsion to be right is rarely about truth alone. If it were, listening would feel safe. Curiosity would remain. Flexibility would be possible. Instead, being right often feels urgent, necessary, like something important is at stake. That urgency reveals its true root: fear. Fear of being diminished, fear of being dismissed, fear of losing status, respect, or coherence. Fear that if your view is wrong, something about you is wrong. Buddhism teaches that this fear comes from ego, not in the sense of arrogance, but in the sense of a fragile identity that feels it must be defended. Ego fear does not want clarity, it wants safety, and safety is sought through correctness. If you are right, you are secure. If you are wrong, you feel exposed. This belief turns dialogue into a battlefield and learning into a threat. Being right becomes a form of armor. This armor is heavy. It keeps the nervous system alert. It sharpens tone. It narrows perception. You stop hearing what the other person is actually saying because you are busy preparing your response. Presence disappears. The moment becomes a contest instead of a meeting. Buddhism teaches that truth does not need defense. Only identity does. When the self is tightly defined, every disagreement feels personal. A challenge to an opinion feels like a challenge to worth. This is why arguments escalate so quickly. The content may be small, but the emotional charge is large. The need to be right also creates distance. Even when you win an argument, something is lost. Connection thins, trust erodes, others feel unseen, and often you feel strangely unsatisfied because what you were really seeking was not victory, but reassurance. Reassurance that you matter, that you are competent, that you are safe. Buddhism does not tell you to abandon discernment or clarity. It does not ask you to agree with falsehood. It asks you to notice the difference between clarity and compulsion. Clarity is calm, compulsion is tense. When clarity is present, you can state your view without force. You can listen without collapse. You can adjust without humiliation. Compulsion does not allow this. It demands certainty and control. This compulsion often comes from early experiences. Times when being wrong had consequences, when mistakes were punished, when confusion was unsafe. The nervous system learned that correctness meant survival. Over time, this survival strategy became habit. Letting go of the need to be right does not mean abandoning yourself. It means updating a strategy that no longer serves you. Buddhism teaches that dignity does not come from winning. It comes from alignment. When you are aligned with honesty and humility, dignity remains, even if you are wrong. There is a quiet dignity in saying, "I don't know," or "I might be mistaken," or "I see it differently, but I'm listening." These words do not weaken you. They stabilize you. They signal that your worth is not on the line. Ego fear resists this. It believes that openness invites attack. But Buddhism shows that openness disarms conflict. When you are not trying to win, others often soften. The atmosphere changes. Dialogue becomes possible. The need to be right also feeds inner conflict. You replay conversations, thinking of better arguments. You rehearse explanations that were never asked for. You try to resolve imaginary debates in your head. This mental noise steals rest. Letting go brings quiet. This does not happen by force. You do not silence the mind by telling it to stop caring. You silence it by seeing that the argument was never about truth. It was about protection. When this is seen clearly, the urgency fades. You can still care about accuracy. You can still correct misinformation when it matters, but the emotional charge is gone. You are no longer fighting for your identity. Buddhism teaches that the self is not fixed. Opinions change. Understanding deepens. Clinging to being right freezes learning. When you loosen that grip, curiosity returns. Curiosity feels different in the body. It is open. It leans forward gently. It listens without preparing a counterattack. This curiosity allows growth without humiliation. Abandoning the need to be right also heals relationships. Many conflicts persist not because of disagreement, but because both sides feel unheard. When you stop insisting on being right, you create space for the other person to feel seen. This often matters more than resolution. This does not mean silencing yourself. It means speaking without needing domination. You express your view, and you allow others to hold theirs. You stop needing the final word. There is relief in this. Conversations become lighter. You stop bracing. You stop defending. You stop measuring yourself against others' reactions. The need to be right also shows up internally. You argue with your own experience. You tell yourself how you should feel. You judge emotions as irrational. Buddhism teaches that this inner argument is another form of ego fear. You are afraid of losing control over your inner world. Letting go here means allowing experience without immediately labeling it wrong. This restores inner dignity. You stop fighting yourself. Dignity is not about superiority, it is about self-respect. When you no longer need to be right, you respect yourself enough to be flexible, to learn, to admit limits. This flexibility is strength. Rigid certainty breaks easily. Flexible understanding adapts. Buddhism also points out that reality is complex. Most situations are not black and white. Multiple perspectives can coexist. Clinging to being right oversimplifies life and creates unnecessary conflict. When you allow complexity, you stop forcing conclusions. You hold nuance. This reduces anxiety because you are no longer trying to compress reality into something manageable. Abandoning the need to be right does not make you passive. It makes you discerning. You choose when to speak and when to let things pass. You save energy for what truly matters. This discernment protects peace. Many arguments are not worth the cost. Being right often costs more than it gives. As ego fear loosens, dignity returns naturally. You feel grounded. You do not need to inflate yourself or collapse. You stand on your own understanding without demanding validation. This dignity feels steady. It does not rise with praise or fall with criticism. It allows you to remain kind, even when challenged. Buddhism teaches that wisdom grows when the mind is not defending itself. When fear relaxes, insight appears. You see more clearly. You listen more deeply. You respond more skillfully. Letting go of the need to be right also creates humility, not the kind that belittles, but the kind that recognizes shared humanity. Everyone is navigating uncertainty. Everyone is shaped by conditions. This humility softens judgment. You stop needing others to be wrong for you to be okay. Over time, the compulsion fades. You notice the urge arise and you let it pass. You choose presence over victory, understanding over control. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no final moment of surrender, just a series of small releases. Each one lightens the heart. And in that lightness, inner dignity becomes something you no longer have to defend. It is simply there, quiet and intact, untouched by arguments, free from the exhausting need to be right. As the need to be right loosens and inner dignity no longer depends on winning, correcting, or proving, a quieter attachment begins to surface. It doesn't argue, it doesn't defend loudly. It sounds gentle, even noble. It speaks in the language of growth, healing, awareness, and becoming better. Yet beneath this soft voice, there is still striving, still comparison, still a subtle sense that where you are now is not enough. This is the attachment to spiritual progress. There is a particular restlessness that appears on inner paths, a sense that peace should deepen, that clarity should last longer, that reactions should be fewer by now. The mind starts keeping score. It looks back and forward. It asks how far it has come and how far it still has to go. And quietly, without noticing, the present moment becomes a stepping stone instead of a place to rest. Spiritual progress feels different from worldly ambition, but it carries the same tension. The object has changed, but the structure remains. Instead of chasing success, approval, or control, the mind chases calm, insight, awakening, or freedom. The chase itself becomes the obstacle. Buddhism points directly at this paradox. The desire for enlightenment prevents enlightenment. The craving for peace blocks peace. The attachment to growth freezes growth. This does not happen because these goals are wrong. It happens because attachment turns them into identity. You begin to measure yourself by how spiritual you feel, how aware you seem, how little you react. When these measures fail, disappointment appears. Self-judgment returns, now dressed in spiritual language. I shouldn't be this angry anymore. I've done too much work to still feel this way. I thought I was past this. These thoughts are not signs of wisdom. They are signs of attachment. The moment you believe you should be somewhere else spiritually, you leave where you are, and where you are is the only place awareness can happen. Buddhism teaches that the path is not a ladder. There is no final rung you stand on permanently. Experience unfolds moment by moment. Some moments are clear, some are confused, some are peaceful, some are turbulent. None of them are mistakes. Spiritual progress becomes harmful when it turns into self-surveillance. You watch yourself constantly. You judge reactions. You rank emotions. You label states as advanced or primitive. This monitoring keeps the mind tight. It creates distance from experience instead of intimacy with it. Awareness does not grow under inspection. It grows under permission. Another subtle trap appears when spiritual progress becomes a way to escape discomfort. You meditate to avoid grief. You practice acceptance to bypass anger. You talk about impermanence to avoid attachment. Buddhism warns against this gently but firmly. Using spiritual ideas to avoid human experience is not liberation. It is avoidance with better vocabulary. True practice allows everything to arise. It does not filter emotions by spiritual acceptability. Attachment to progress also creates comparison. You compare your inner life to others, to teachers, to imagined ideals. This comparison creates either pride or discouragement. Both are distractions. When you feel ahead, humility weakens. When you feel behind, trust erodes. Either way, the present moment is lost. Buddhism teaches that there is no ahead or behind on the path. There is only this moment and how clearly it is known. Another cost of clinging to spiritual progress is impatience. You want results. You want confirmation. You want assurance that the practice is working. When these are not felt, doubt creeps in. The mind asks whether it is doing it wrong. But awareness is not a technique that produces guaranteed outcomes. It is a relationship with reality. Relationships deepen over time through presence, not through force. Letting go of spiritual progress does not mean abandoning practice. It means releasing the idea that practice should feel a certain way. Some days are quiet, some are restless, some are dull, some are sharp. All are part of the path. When you stop demanding progress, practice becomes honest. You meet each moment as it is, not as a test of advancement. There is also grief hidden inside spiritual striving, grief for the imagined self who would finally be free, calm, untouched, whole. Letting go of progress means letting go of that image. This can feel like loss, but what you gain is real contact with life. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not becoming special. It is becoming ordinary. It is seeing clearly without needing to be different. The mind resists this because ordinariness feels like failure when progress is the goal, yet ordinariness is where freedom lives. Spiritual attachment often hides in subtle superiority, feeling more aware than others, more evolved, more detached. This separates you from humanity. Buddhism dissolves this by reminding you that suffering is shared, and awakening does not remove you from it. Letting go of spiritual progress restores humility. You stop ranking experiences, you stop categorizing people, you stop needing to be advanced. This humility is not diminishing, it is grounding. Another hidden effect of progress attachment is tension in the body. Trying to maintain calm, trying to stay mindful, trying not to react. This effort creates stiffness. Awareness becomes rigid. Buddhism teaches relaxed attention, attention that includes effort but is not strained. When progress is released, attention softens. The body breathes, the mind opens. Spiritual growth then happens naturally, without being tracked. There is also freedom from disappointment here. When you no longer expect practice to eliminate difficulty, difficulty no longer feels like failure. You meet it with curiosity instead of judgment. This does not make pain disappear. It changes how pain is held. Letting go of spiritual progress also heals self-trust. You stop outsourcing your worth to imagined milestones. You trust that showing up sincerely is enough. This sincerity is powerful. It does not seek recognition. It does not demand outcomes. It is quiet and consistent. Buddhism teaches that wisdom is not accumulated. It is revealed when obstacles fall away. Attachment to progress is one such obstacle. When you release it, awareness becomes simpler. You notice breath, sensation, thought. You do not need them to add up to anything. They are complete as they are. This simplicity is deeply restful. You no longer ask whether you are doing it right. You ask whether you are present, and presence answers itself. Over time, this approach reshapes how you live. You stop using spirituality to judge yourself. You stop trying to become someone else. You meet yourself again and again without agenda. Growth still happens, insight still appears, but they arrive quietly, without announcement. You may not even notice until later, and that is the point. When you stop chasing peace, peace becomes available. When you stop demanding enlightenment, clarity arises. When you let go of becoming, being unfolds. Nothing needs to be achieved. Nothing needs to be proven. Practice becomes life itself, moving naturally, without comparison, without pressure, without the exhausting need to measure how far you've come. What remains is simple presence, and in that presence, the very thing you were striving for is already here. As the chasing of spiritual progress relaxes, and the need to arrive somewhere finally softens, attention turns outward again, but in a different way than before. Without agendas and without the pressure to fix yourself, you begin to notice how often care turns into interference, how love becomes advice, how concern becomes control, how the wish to help quietly overrides respect for another person's process. This is where a deeper form of kindness waits to be understood. There is an uncomfortable feeling many people recognize. You see someone struggle, you sense their pain, and almost immediately, something in you moves forward. You want to say something, do something, fix something. The urge feels compassionate, it feels human, but it also carries tension, a subtle belief that the situation should be different and that you are responsible for making it so. Buddhism asks you to pause right here, not to withdraw care, but to examine the impulse, because very often the urge to intervene is not only about the other person, it is also about your discomfort with witnessing suffering. Non-interference as compassion begins with honesty about this discomfort. It recognizes that seeing pain can be unbearable, especially when you feel close to the person experiencing it. The mind wants relief, and if it cannot remove the pain directly, it tries to remove the feeling of helplessness by acting. This action is not always helpful. Intervening too quickly can rob others of their dignity. It can signal that you do not trust their capacity to navigate their own experience. It can interrupt processes that need time, confusion, and even failure to unfold naturally. Buddhism teaches that compassion is not measured by how much you do, but by how wisely you respond. There is a deep difference between support and interference. Support creates space. Interference collapses it. Support listens. Interference instructs. Support stands nearby. Interference steps in front. This difference is subtle, and many people cross the line without realizing it, especially when intentions are good. Parents do this with children. Partners do this with each other. Friends do this in moments of vulnerability. Even helpers and healers fall into this pattern. Non-interference does not mean indifference. It means trusting life enough to allow it to work through people without constant correction. Buddhism understands that growth often requires struggle, not unnecessary suffering, but real engagement with difficulty. When someone is always rescued, they are deprived of learning how to stand on their own ground. This creates dependence, not strength. This is one reason non-interference can feel cruel at first. It goes against the instinct to relieve pain immediately. It asks you to tolerate your own discomfort while someone else works through theirs. This tolerance is not passive, it is active restraint. Restraint is rarely celebrated. Doing nothing looks like neglect in a culture that values action. But Buddhism recognizes restraint as a refined skill. It requires awareness, humility, and trust. Trust that the other person's process matters. Trust that pain is not always a mistake. Trust that not every problem is yours to solve. There is also emotional interference. This happens when you try to manage how someone feels. You cheer them up too quickly. You minimize their pain. You push acceptance before they are ready. You try to replace grief with perspective. While these responses may come from love, they often silence the person's actual experience. Buddhism teaches that being present with pain is more compassionate than trying to remove it. Presence says, "I'm here." Interference says, "You shouldn't feel this." Non-interference allows emotions to exist without correction. It does not rush someone through stages. It does not impose timelines or meanings. It does not insist on lessons. This kind of compassion is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not seek appreciation. It does not need to be seen as helpful. And that is exactly why it is so powerful. Interference is often driven by subtle ego needs. The need to be useful, the need to be needed, the need to feel competent or wise. Buddhism invites you to notice these needs without judgment. Not to shame them, but to see how they can distort care. When helping becomes a way to stabilize your identity, it stops being about the other person. Non-interference frees you from this trap. You no longer need to prove your kindness through action. Your presence becomes enough. This does not mean you never act. There are moments when intervention is necessary, when harm is immediate, when boundaries are being crossed, when safety is at risk. Buddhism does not advocate passivity in the face of danger. The key difference is motivation. Are you acting from clarity or from anxiety? From wisdom or from discomfort? From respect or from control? Non-interference asks you to slow down enough to feel the answer. Another form of interference is advice giving. Advice often arrives too early, before understanding is complete, before the person has fully expressed themselves. Advice can feel dismissive even when accurate. It shifts focus away from listening. Buddhism values deep listening as a form of compassion. Listening without preparing solutions, without rehearsing wisdom, without steering the conversation toward closure. Listening requires patience. It requires humility. It requires letting go of the idea that you know what is best. Non-interference also applies to internal life. You interfere with yourself when you try to correct emotions as soon as they arise, when you judge your reactions, when you tell yourself to be calmer wiser, more detached. This inner interference mirrors outer interference. Buddhism teaches allowing instead of correcting, letting emotions arise, peak, and pass without management. This non-interference creates inner safety, and inner safety is what allows healing. There is a fear that without interference, things will fall apart, that problems will grow, that people will make irreversible mistakes. Buddhism acknowledges this fear but points out that interference often does not prevent mistakes. It only delays learning. Mistakes are part of life. Trying to eliminate them creates fragility. Non-interference strengthens resilience. It allows people to meet consequences, integrate experience, and grow from within. This also preserves relationships. When you stop interfering, others feel respected. They feel trusted. They feel less defensive. They may even become more open to support because it is no longer forced. Interference creates resistance. Non-interference invites cooperation. There is also a spiritual humility here. You recognize that you do not see the full picture, that your understanding is partial, that life is complex. This humility softens certainty and opens space for mystery. Buddhism teaches that compassion is not about controlling outcomes. It is about reducing suffering where possible without creating more suffering through intrusion. Sometimes the most compassionate act is to stay close and silent, to allow tears, to allow confusion, to allow time. This kind of compassion requires strength. It goes against the urge to fix. It goes against impatience. It goes against the fear of appearing unhelpful. But it builds trust, not only in others, but in life itself. Non-interference also means allowing people to dislike you. When you stop stepping in, some may feel abandoned or disappointed. They may accuse you of not caring. Buddhism teaches that caring does not always look like intervention. You can care deeply and still step back. This stepping back is not rejection. It is respect for autonomy. Another aspect of non-interference is knowing when your involvement causes harm. Sometimes your presence adds pressure. Your concern becomes surveillance. Your help becomes obligation. Buddhism teaches that stepping away in these moments is an act of kindness. This is especially important in close relationships. Love can become entangled when boundaries are unclear. Non-interference restores balance. It allows each person to carry their own life. Non-interference also protects your energy. Constantly intervening drains compassion. It leads to burnout. Buddhism teaches that compassion must be sustainable. Otherwise, it turns into resentment. Sustainable compassion includes limits. It includes rest. It includes knowing when to let go. This does not make you cold. It makes you steady. As you practice non-interference, something changes in how you relate to suffering. You stop seeing it as a problem to solve and start seeing it as a reality to meet. This shifts your entire posture toward life. You become less frantic, more grounded, more patient. You also begin to trust that people have inner wisdom, that life itself teaches, that your role is not always to intervene, but sometimes to witness. Witnessing is not passive. It is attentive. It is present. It is open. This presence communicates something powerful. I trust you to walk your path. Few messages are more empowering than this. Buddhism teaches that compassion without interference honors impermanence. It accepts that things change on their own schedule, that suffering is not permanent, that growth cannot be forced. When you stop interfering, you stop trying to control the arc of someone else's life. You allow it to unfold. This is not easy. It requires courage to let go of control, courage to sit with uncertainty, courage to allow outcomes you cannot predict. But this courage deepens peace, both yours and theirs. Non-interference also removes moral superiority. You stop positioning yourself as the one who knows. You meet others as equals, fellow humans navigating difficulty. This equality is felt. It softens interaction. It builds genuine connection. As this practice deepens, kindness becomes quieter, less performative, more spacious. You are no longer trying to be a good person. You are simply responding with awareness. And in that awareness, compassion takes on a different shape, not something you do to others, but something that flows naturally when you stop getting in the way. Nothing needs to be corrected. Nothing needs to be rushed. Life moves, learns, and heals on its own terms. Your role becomes simpler: to be present, to be honest, to be respectful of processes that are not yours. And in this simplicity, a deeper kindness emerges. One that does not interfere, does not dominate, and does not demand credit. A kindness that trusts life enough to step back and allow it to breathe. As non-interference settles in and the urge to step in, fix, or manage others begins to soften, another habit quietly becomes visible. Even when you stop interfering outwardly, the mind often continues to interfere inwardly. It travels ahead of the present moment, scanning the future, rehearsing pain that has not yet arrived. The body responds as if the suffering were already real. And in this way, the mind creates an extra layer of pain long before life asks you to carry it. There is a particular kind of heaviness that does not come from what is happening now. It comes from what you think will happen later. A tightening that appears when you imagine loss, rejection, illness, failure, or loneliness before any of it has occurred. This heaviness feels responsible. It feels like preparation, but Buddhism names it clearly: emotional forecasting, and it is one of the most destructive habits of the human mind. Emotional forecasting is the belief that anticipating pain will protect you from it. The mind tells itself that if it expects the worst, it will be less shocked, less hurt, less vulnerable. But the body does not experience imagination as theory. It experiences it as reality. Fear imagined is fear felt. Grief imagined is grief rehearsed. And this rehearsal exhausts the nervous system. Buddhism teaches that much of human suffering does not come from pain itself, but from adding future pain to the present moment. You carry tomorrow's sorrow today. You live losses before they happen. You mourn events that may never occur. And while the future remains untouched, your body pays the price now. This habit often begins as a form of care. You worry because you love. You anticipate because you want to be ready. But slowly, the mind confuses readiness with control. It believes that by thinking through every painful possibility, it can somehow soften the blow. In truth, it doubles the blow. Pain, when it comes, is one experience. Emotional forecasting turns it into two: the imagined pain and the real one. Buddhism observes that the mind is especially skilled at predicting suffering, but remarkably poor at predicting resilience. When you forecast the future, you imagine yourself fragile, overwhelmed, unable to cope. You forget how many times you have already survived pain you once believed would break you. Forecasting strips the future of uncertainty and fills it with certainty of harm, and certainty of harm creates despair. The present moment may be manageable, but the future, as imagined, feels unbearable. This is why anxiety often feels worse than the events it fears. Anxiety is suffering without reality's limits. Reality arrives one moment at a time. Anxiety arrives all at once. Buddhism teaches that the future does not exist in experience. It exists only as thought, and thoughts, no matter how vivid, are not events. When you treat thoughts as events, the body reacts as if danger is present. Stress hormones rise, muscles tighten, breath shortens. The system enters survival mode for a threat that may never come. This is why emotional forecasting is more destructive than pain itself. Pain happens when it happens. Forecasting happens continuously. Another cruelty of forecasting is how it robs joy from neutral or pleasant moments. You may be safe now, connected now, breathing easily now, but the mind whispers, enjoy it while it lasts. This thought poisons the moment. You are already bracing for its end. Buddhism calls this dukkha added on top of dukkha, suffering layered onto suffering. Forecasting also narrows perception. You stop seeing possibilities. You see only one outcome, usually the worst. The mind becomes rigid. Hope feels foolish. Trust feels dangerous. And this rigidity creates emotional isolation. You suffer alone in scenarios that exist only in imagination. Why does the mind do this? Buddhism traces it back to fear and attachment. You fear losing what you love. You fear becoming what you once were. You fear returning to pain you barely escaped. Forecasting feels like vigilance, but vigilance without rest becomes torment. The Buddha taught that the mind, when untrained, moves compulsively toward past regret and future fear. Freedom begins when attention returns to what is actually here. Cutting the loop of emotional forecasting does not mean denying future challenges. It means refusing to suffer twice. Buddhism offers a simple but profound shift. Meet only the pain that is present, not the pain that might arrive, not the pain your mind predicts, only what is here now. This requires courage, because the mind argues that without forecasting, you will be unprepared. Buddhism responds with a deeper truth. You cannot prepare emotionally for pain by suffering early. You can only exhaust yourself. Preparation happens through clarity and presence, not fear. Another way forecasting harms is by collapsing time. A future event becomes emotionally immediate. The body does not know the difference. You feel the weight now. Days, weeks, even years of peace are sacrificed to one imagined moment. Buddhism teaches impermanence not to create fear, but to restore balance. Yes, things change. Yes, loss is possible. But this moment is not that moment. Mixing them creates unnecessary suffering. Emotional forecasting also erodes trust in yourself. You assume future you will not cope. You forget your capacity to adapt. Buddhism reminds you that coping skills emerge in context. You do not need them now for events that are not happening now. When pain arrives, it brings information, resources, and support that do not exist in imagination. Forecasting removes all of that and leaves only fear. Another hidden cost is how forecasting interferes with connection. You pull away to protect yourself from anticipated loss. You withhold love to avoid future grief. You limit attachment because you fear the ending. Buddhism teaches that this is suffering before suffering, and it shrinks life. Love always carries risk. Avoiding love to avoid pain does not protect you. It only ensures loneliness. The Buddhist response is not reckless attachment, it is present attachment. Loving without demanding permanence, caring without rehearsing loss. Forecasting also shows up in self-judgment. You predict how badly you will fail, how ashamed you will feel, how disappointed others will be. You punish yourself in advance. This drains confidence and reduces willingness to engage with life. Buddhism teaches compassion toward the unknown future self. You do not know how you will respond, and that not knowing is not weakness, it is honesty. To cut the forecasting loop, Buddhism emphasizes grounding attention in direct experience, sensation, breath, sound, what is verifiable now. Each time the mind jumps ahead, you gently return, not with force, but with recognition. This is a thought, not an event. This practice is not about suppressing fear. Fear may still arise, but you do not feed it with stories. Over time, the mind learns that it does not need to patrol the future to stay safe. The body relaxes. The nervous system regains flexibility. Another key insight is that forecasting often disguises itself as realism. I'm just being realistic, the mind says. But realism is seeing what is, not insisting on what might go wrong. Buddhism teaches that wisdom holds uncertainty without collapsing into dread. It allows multiple outcomes. It does not cling to the worst one. When uncertainty is allowed, space opens. In that space, creativity, adaptability, and resilience can appear. Forecasting suffocates these qualities. Letting go of forecasting also restores time. You stop spending tomorrow's energy today. You arrive more fully in the present. Meals taste better. Conversations feel warmer. sleep comes easier. Pain, when it comes, will be met with more resources because you have not depleted them in advance. This does not mean life becomes painless. It means pain is no longer multiplied. Buddhism does not promise that nothing bad will happen. It promises that you do not have to live inside bad things that are not happening. As this understanding deepens, you begin to notice how often fear tries to pull you forward in time. And each time, you have a choice. Follow the story, or return to the moment. Returning is not avoidance. It is wisdom. The present moment may contain discomfort, uncertainty, or sadness, but it also contains breath, ground, and awareness. These are always enough for now. Emotional forecasting steals now for a maybe. Buddhism gives now back to you. And as you practice meeting only what is here, something shifts quietly. The future loosens its grip. Fear loses urgency. Trust grows, not trust that nothing painful will happen, but trust that you will meet it when it does, not before. In this trust, suffering becomes lighter, life becomes more spacious, and the mind, no longer trapped in imagined pain, finally learns how to rest where it actually lives, here. As the grip of imagined futures loosens, and the mind no longer spends its energy rehearsing pain that has not arrived, another habit becomes easier to see. Even when you stop predicting what will happen next, the mind often stays busy shaping what has already happened and what is happening now. It edits, it explains, it arranges events into a story that is meant to make sense, protect identity, and maintain control. And quietly, without being noticed, this constant storytelling becomes another source of suffering. There is a subtle tension that comes from needing your life to follow a coherent narrative. A beginning that explains you, a middle that justifies you, an ending that redeems you. When events don't fit neatly into this structure, discomfort arises. Confusion feels threatening, randomness feels unfair, silence feels unfinished. So the mind steps in and starts writing. This writing happens all the time. You tell yourself who you are based on what happened to you. You explain why things turned out the way they did. You assign meaning, motives, lessons, and identities. On the surface, this seems helpful. Stories give order, stories give continuity, stories help you remember. But Buddhism asks you to look deeper and notice the cost of constantly controlling the narrative. Narrative control is the belief that peace depends on having a story that makes sense, that suffering becomes bearable if it can be explained, that identity is secure if it is consistent. This belief turns life into a manuscript that must be revised again and again to maintain emotional safety. The problem is not that stories exist. The problem is that you cling to them. When you are attached to a life story, every new experience is evaluated based on whether it fits. If it does, relief appears. If it doesn't, anxiety follows. You begin to correct the story. You reinterpret events. You rewrite intentions. You defend your role. And the present moment becomes less about living and more about editing. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises not from experience itself, but from resistance to experience. Narrative control is a refined form of resistance. You resist what is by turning it into what it means. This meaning-making often happens so quickly that it feels automatic. Something happens, and instantly the mind says, "This always happens to me," or "This proves who I am," or "This shouldn't have happened," or "This will ruin everything." These sentences shape emotion more than the event itself. The story becomes the pain. One of the deepest Buddhist insights is that reality does not come with a script. It unfolds moment by moment, shaped by countless conditions, many of which cannot be known. When you insist on a script, you fight this unfolding, and that fight creates tension. Narrative control also creates identity suffering. You become attached to being a certain kind of person with a certain kind of life. When events threaten that identity, fear appears. You feel destabilized, not because something bad happened, but because the story is cracking. Buddhism teaches that the self is not a story. It is an activity, a process, a flow of sensations, thoughts, and responses. When you reduce yourself to a narrative, you freeze what is fluid. This freezing makes change feel dangerous. Growth becomes betrayal of the old story. Healing becomes confusing if it doesn't follow the expected arc. You ask whether you are still you if the narrative shifts. Letting go of narrative control does not mean losing memory or meaning. It means loosening the belief that your life must make sense in a particular way for you to be at peace. Stories often serve the ego. They protect you from shame. They justify your actions. They explain why you are the way you are. This can feel comforting, but it also keeps you trapped. Every time someone challenges your story, you feel threatened. You defend it. You argue. You feel misunderstood. Freedom from narrative control begins when you notice how much energy is spent maintaining coherence. There is also a subtle pride in having a story, being the survivor, the misunderstood one, the strong one, the one who overcame. These identities can be empowering, but they also become roles you feel obligated to perform. You limit yourself to stay consistent with the narrative. Buddhism invites you to see that no story can hold the fullness of a life. No explanation can capture all causes. No label can contain all moments. When you accept this, the need to edit relaxes. Another source of suffering is retroactive storytelling. You look back and reinterpret the past to fit who you are now. You judge earlier versions of yourself harshly. You feel regret not only for actions, but for not knowing what you know now. This creates unnecessary guilt. Buddhism teaches compassion for past selves. They acted with the awareness available at the time. Rewriting the story to assign blame does not heal. It only creates distance from your own humanity. Narrative control also appears in anticipation. You imagine how today's events will look in the future story. You act with an audience in mind. You worry about how this chapter will be judged. This pulls you out of the moment. Living with a script turns life into performance. The Buddhist alternative is radical presence, meeting each moment without needing it to represent anything beyond itself. This does not mean abandoning reflection. It means not letting reflection dominate experience. When you stop narrating constantly, something surprising happens. Experience feels richer, more immediate, less filtered. You notice details instead of conclusions, sensations instead of interpretations. This presence can feel unfamiliar at first. Without a story, the mind feels unanchored. It asks, "What does this mean?" Buddhism teaches that not everything needs to mean something. Some things simply happen. This is deeply freeing. Freedom from narrative control also softens suffering. When pain arises, you do not immediately wrap it in a story about injustice, fate, or identity. You feel the pain directly. Without commentary, pain moves more quickly. Stories make it linger. Another benefit is flexibility. Without a fixed script, you adapt more easily. You change direction without feeling like you failed. You grow without feeling inconsistent. You allow life to surprise you. Buddhism teaches that impermanence applies not only to circumstances, but to stories themselves. Who you are today is not who you were 10 years ago, and that is not a problem. It is life. Narrative control also fuels comparison. You compare your story to others. Who is ahead? Who is behind? Who has a better arc? This comparison breeds dissatisfaction. Buddhism dissolves this by removing the need for a narrative altogether. Without a script, there is no race. This does not mean life becomes meaningless. Meaning arises naturally when you are present. It does not need to be manufactured. Often the most meaningful moments are those you never planned or understood at the time. Letting go of narrative control also improves relationships. You stop assigning roles to others. You stop expecting them to behave according to your story. You meet them as they are now, not as characters in your life arc. This meeting creates freshness. Conversations feel alive. Conflict feels less personal. Change feels less threatening. Buddhism teaches that clinging to views is a cause of suffering. A life story is one of the strongest views you can cling to. Releasing it does not erase you. It reveals you. When you are no longer editing, you are living. This does not happen all at once. The habit of storytelling is strong. The mind will continue to narrate. Freedom comes not from stopping stories, but from not believing them so fully. And you notice the story arise. You see its tone, its agenda, and you return to experience. Over time, stories lose authority. They become background noise instead of instructions. This creates inner spaciousness. You are not constantly explaining yourself to yourself. The mind quiets, the body relaxes. There is also humility here. You accept that you do not fully know what your life means. That meaning may unfold later or not at all, and that this uncertainty is not a threat. Living without a script does not mean chaos. It means responsiveness. You respond to what is here instead of forcing it into a predetermined shape. This responsiveness feels alive. It feels honest. It feels real. You laugh when something is funny, not because it fits your story. You grieve when something hurts, not because it aligns with your identity. You act when action is needed, not because it advances a narrative. Buddhism calls this freedom, not freedom from events, but freedom from the need to control how events define you. As this understanding settles, life feels less heavy. You are no longer carrying a book that must be constantly revised. You carry only what is happening now. Moments come and go. Some are pleasant, some are painful. None need to justify themselves. And in this simplicity, something profound appears. A sense of ease that does not depend on explanation, a dignity that does not require a storyline, a freedom that comes not from having the right story, but from no longer needing one at all. Life unfolds. You move with it. Unscripted, unedited, and finally, at rest in the only place it ever happens. As the habit of controlling the story of your life softens, another impulse becomes easier to notice. Even when you stop rewriting events and releasing the need for a script, there is still a powerful urge that pulls at the heart when you see someone else struggling, an almost reflexive movement toward action, toward fixing, toward rescuing. It feels caring, it feels responsible, and yet beneath it lives tension, pressure, and a quiet erosion of dignity, both yours and theirs. There is a discomfort that arises when you witness pain, not only the pain of strangers, but especially the pain of those you love. The mind tightens, the chest contracts. A voice appears that says, "Do something." This voice is often praised by society. It is called kindness. It is called support. But Buddhism asks a harder question. What happens when helping becomes interference and rescuing becomes a form of control? The discipline of not fixing is one of the most misunderstood Buddhist teachings. It sounds passive to a culture that values action. It sounds cold to a heart that wants to protect. But in truth, it is a deeply refined form of compassion, one that requires restraint, humility, and trust. Fixing is not the same as caring. Fixing implies that something is wrong and must be corrected. Caring implies presence without judgment. When you rush to fix, you silently communicate that the other person's current state is unacceptable or insufficient. Even when intentions are good, this message can wound. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not always a problem to solve. Sometimes it is a process to pass through. When you interfere too quickly, you interrupt that process. You take away the person's chance to meet their own strength, insight, and learning. This is where dignity is preserved or lost. Dignity grows when a person feels trusted. It shrinks when they feel managed. Rescuing often comes from discomfort with helplessness. Watching someone struggle activates fear. Fear that they will fail. Fear that they will hurt longer. Fear that you will be seen as uncaring if you do nothing. This fear pushes action, but action driven by fear rarely leads to wisdom. Buddhism teaches that restraint is not neglect. It is an intentional pause that allows clarity to arise. Before stepping in, you ask, is this about their need or my discomfort? Many people fix because fixing gives them a role. The helper, the savior, the wise one. These roles feel meaningful, but they can quietly create imbalance. One person becomes active, the other becomes passive. Over time, this dynamic drains both. The one who fixes becomes exhausted and resentful. The one who is fixed becomes dependent or diminished. Neither feels fully respected. The discipline of not fixing restores balance. It allows both people to remain whole. This does not mean you never help. Buddhism is not indifferent to suffering. It simply teaches that timing and motivation matter more than action itself. Help offered too early can be as harmful as help withheld too long. Rescuing can also block emotional processing. When someone is grieving, confused, or afraid, your attempt to fix may push them out of their experience before it has been fully felt. Pain that is bypassed does not disappear, it waits. Buddhism teaches that being with pain is more healing than trying to remove it. This requires patience. It requires sitting in uncertainty. It requires tolerating the feeling that you are not useful in the way you were taught to be. There is also humility here. You admit that you do not fully understand another person's path, that their suffering may be teaching them something you cannot see, that your solution may not be their solution. Not fixing honors autonomy. It says, I trust your process. This trust is powerful. It strengthens the other person's confidence. It invites them to listen to their own inner wisdom instead of relying on yours. The discipline of not fixing also applies in emotional conversations. Someone shares pain, and immediately the mind offers advice, perspective, solutions. Buddhism teaches deep listening instead, listening without agenda, without steering, without trying to close the discomfort. This kind of listening is rare, and it is healing. It allows the speaker to hear themselves. Often clarity arises not from advice, but from being heard fully. Fixing interrupts this. There is also a subtle form of fixing that happens through positivity. You encourage optimism too quickly. You minimize pain. You point out silver linings. While these responses may feel supportive, they can silence genuine emotion. Buddhism teaches that validation comes before transformation. Without validation, transformation becomes forced. The discipline of not fixing also protects you. When you take responsibility for others' outcomes, you carry weight that is not yours. You feel guilty when things don't improve. You blame yourself when your help doesn't work. This leads to burnout. Restraint frees you from this burden. You can care deeply without owning results. This teaching is especially important in long-term relationships. Over time, constant fixing erodes intimacy. The person being fixed feels scrutinized. The fixer feels unappreciated. Both feel misunderstood. When fixing stops, something surprising happens. The relationship breathes, conversations soften, power equalizes. Buddhism teaches that compassion must include wisdom. Wisdom knows when to act and when to step back. Not fixing is an act of wisdom. There is also courage in not fixing. It takes courage to let someone make their own mistakes, to let them feel consequences, to let life teach instead of stepping in. This courage is not indifference. It is faith in resilience. Rescuing often comes from the belief that pain is unbearable. Buddhism teaches that pain is part of life, but suffering is what happens when pain is resisted. When you rescue someone from every discomfort, you teach them to fear pain. When you allow them to meet it with support, you teach them strength. Not fixing also preserves your own dignity. You stop using helpfulness as proof of worth. You stop measuring your value by how needed you are. You rest in presence rather than performance. This presence communicates something powerful. I am here with you, not above you. There is also clarity here about boundaries. Not fixing does not mean allowing harm. If someone is in danger, action is necessary. Buddhism is clear about this. Compassion includes protection when needed. The discipline lies in distinguishing danger from discomfort. Discomfort is not an emergency. Growth often requires it. Not fixing also applies inwardly. You stop trying to fix your own emotions the moment they arise. You stop telling yourself to be different. You allow feelings to move. This inner non-fixing creates self-trust. When you practice this internally, it becomes easier to practice externally. Another aspect of this teaching is patience with time. Some processes cannot be sped up. Grief, integration, insight, fixing tries to compress time. Buddhism respects its pace. Time, when allowed, does much of the healing on its own. Not fixing also dismantles superiority. You no longer see yourself as the one who knows. You meet others as equals, navigating uncertainty together. This equality deepens connection. There is a quiet confidence that comes with restraint. You do not rush. You do not panic. You do not need to prove your compassion through action. Your calm becomes a resource for others. They feel less alone, not because you solved their problem, but because you stayed. Staying is sometimes the greatest gift. Buddhism teaches that the impulse to rescue is often rooted in fear of loss. Fear that if you don't act, things will fall apart. Over time, you learn that many things fall apart and reform without your intervention. Life is resilient. Trusting this resilience allows you to relax. The discipline of not fixing is not about doing nothing. It is about doing less, more wisely. You wait, you listen, you observe. You act only when action truly serves. This discipline feels subtle, but its impact is profound. It preserves dignity. It deepens trust. It prevents burnout. It honors life's intelligence. When you stop fixing, you stop interfering with growth. You allow others to meet themselves. You allow yourself to rest. Compassion becomes spacious. Relationships become balanced. You are no longer the rescuer or the rescued. You are simply present. And in this presence, something gentle unfolds. People rise on their own. Pain moves in its own time. Life teaches what no fixer ever could. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be corrected immediately. You remain attentive, respectful, and calm. This is the discipline. And in its quiet restraint, dignity is preserved on both sides, without effort, without control, without harm. Tonight, you've walked through many quiet truths. You've seen how control hides in effort, in identity, in stories, in healing, in helping, in being right, in becoming better, in predicting pain, and even in love itself. You've seen how much weight comes not from life, but from resisting life, and slowly, gently, that grip has begun to loosen. Buddhist wisdom does not ask you to stop caring. It asks you to stop clinging, to stop forcing, to stop carrying what was never yours to control. When you release that burden, peace does not need to be chased. It arrives on its own, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, quiet, and real. As you rest now, remember this. You do not have to fix yourself, fix others, fix the past, or secure the future. Life is already unfolding, and you are allowed to meet it with open hands instead of clenched fists. If something in this journey touched you, leave a comment with the words, "I let go." Let it be a small promise to yourself, written softly, without effort. And if these teachings help you rest, reflect, or feel less alone, consider subscribing to the channel. More calm, clarity, and wisdom will be here for you whenever you need it. Now allow your body to soften. Let the mind grow quiet. Nothing else needs to be done.